Before the world heard the thunder of hooves, it had already forgotten to listen to the wind. In the 12th century, the great continents of Europe and Asia were not bound together, but scattered like islands of pride. Every kingdom believed itself eternal. Every empire, in its marble or its sand, thought the sun revolved only around its walls. Yet beyond those walls, in the open emptiness of the steppe, something ancient was gathering, a patience that had been silent for centuries. To the west, Europe was weary. The age of crusades had burned its youth in distant deserts, and the echo of faith was growing faint against the clatter of ambition. Kings feuded over crowns, popes blessed their own wars, and peasants looked to the sky for signs that never came. The idea of unity was a dream best left to dying emperors and poets. Beyond the frozen rivers, forests still swallowed entire armies, and no one yet imagined that one day riders from the east would gallop through them faster than word itself. Farther south, the Islamic world shimmered with brilliance and suspicion. Baghdad, once the heart of wisdom, still guarded its libraries like treasures of the soul, but its caliphs were shadows compared to the scholars they sponsored. Old cities quarreled like jealous brothers. Trade routes whispered of wealth, yet merchants crossed them with unease. Rumors spoke of restless horsemen, but the civilized scoffed. The desert had always produced wanderers. None had yet changed the map of the heavens. In China, the Song dynasty flourished in art and poetry but suffered beneath its own perfection. Its emperors built walls against everything they feared: barbarians, bandits, even ideas. The north groaned under rival dynasties. The Jin, fierce and disciplined, who built their own walls of iron. Yet behind those barriers, life was brittle. Luxury had replaced hunger. Bureaucracy had replaced spirit. The empire's heart beat softly, too certain of its own order to imagine the sky could shift. Between these worlds stretched the steppe, endless, harsh, and free. Here there were no borders, only horizons. The tribes who roamed it spoke to the wind more than to kings. They hunted, traded, fought, and vanished. Their alliances were as brief as spring rains, their faith in motion itself. To outsiders they seemed primitive, but within that wildness lay balance. They knew every gust of grass, every rhythm of hooves. They were the memory of movement in a world that had grown still. While the courts of China composed poetry and Europe debated salvation, the steppe remembered only survival. In this vast silence, storms were born not from clouds, but from hunger and vision. The world beyond could not hear it, the soft gathering of tribes, the forgotten songs of riders echoing through valleys of bone. They had no parchment, no palaces, no priests. What they had was the horizon and the unbroken faith that the sky watched all things equally. History, at that moment, was asleep. Each civilization dreamed its own dream of greatness, unaware that the same wind touched them all. The merchants of Persia, the monks of Kiev, the poets of Kaifeng, all lived under the same sun, yet none believed their fates could intertwine. Distance was safety, ignorance was comfort. And so, the great powers rested, wrapped in the illusion of permanence. But the earth itself seemed to sense change. Caravans began to vanish along old routes. Traders whispered of distant raids that moved like lightning and left no bodies behind. Strange horses were said to drink rivers dry. The stories drifted westward, dismissed as superstition, yet they carried a chill. Something unseen was stirring beyond the mountains, an intelligence born not from books but from endurance. In the north, under the shadow of the eternal blue sky, a boy named Temüjin learned that loyalty was worth more than blood. His tribe betrayed him, his father's friends turned to enemies, and his childhood was carved from hunger. Yet from that emptiness came clarity. Where others saw survival, he saw order. Where others saw tribes, he saw a single pulse. The world may not have known his name, but it was already preparing to remember it. The 12th century stood poised on a quiet edge. Across Europe and Asia, the great powers looked inward, blinded by their own light. They built walls higher, wrote laws thicker, and prayed louder, believing themselves safe behind centuries of habit. But the wind had begun to change direction. It carried dust from the east, the scent of horse and fire, the whisper of unity in a world divided. And soon, that whisper would become thunder. History remembers his empire, but not the loneliness that built it. Long before the world called him Genghis Khan, he was simply Temüjin, a boy born to hunger, wind, and silence. His cradle was the saddle, his lullaby the cry of wolves. On the Mongolian steppe, where winters stripped flesh from bone and summers burned the horizon pale, survival was the only teacher, and it taught without mercy. His childhood unfolded not in palaces or under banners, but in the raw vastness of a world that gave nothing freely. Temüjin's father, Ögedei, was a minor chief, brave, shrewd, but small in the eyes of greater clans. When he died suddenly, poisoned by rival Tatars, his family's fragile status crumbled overnight. His mother, Hörlun, gathered her children and fled into the wilderness. There was no tribe to shelter them, no herd to sustain them. They lived on roots, berries, and whatever small animals Temüjin could catch with bare hands. Hunger became a daily presence, a ghost that sat beside them at every fire. Yet even in misery, his mother's voice held firm. She told him that no one survives alone, that strength without loyalty is nothing but wind. The boy listened. Somewhere in that emptiness, a seed was planted. Isolation shaped him more deeply than any victory ever could. Cut off from kin and betrayed by those who had once bowed to his father, Temüjin learned to see the world not through birthright, but through choice. Blood had failed him. Only trust could rebuild what was lost. He watched the steppe with quiet understanding. The wolves hunted not by lineage, but by unity. They survived because they moved as one. That lesson would follow him for the rest of his life. Yet the steppe was not kind to dreamers. Rival tribes hunted his family like prey. Once, they captured Temüjin, binding him with a wooden collar so heavy he could neither fight nor flee. For days he was paraded as a slave, humiliated and forgotten by the world. But one night, under the vast silence of the moon, he escaped. He fled into the river, the wooden yoke dragging him down. Cold water filled his lungs, but he refused to sink. Somehow, the boy who had nothing found the strength to rise. When he broke through the surface, gasping, the stars above him seemed close enough to touch. From that night on, he carried a quiet certainty that the sky itself had spared him for a reason. As he grew older, Temüjin began to gather people, not through wealth or fear, but through promise. He sought out those who had been cast aside, the abandoned, the orphaned, the loyal without masters. Each man he met was given the same vow, loyalty in exchange for loyalty. It was a simple creed, but revolutionary in a land where betrayal was as common as breath. Those who followed him found not a lord, but a leader who remembered hunger. He shared their spoils, their hardships, their silence. Slowly, from the ashes of exile, a brotherhood began to form. Still, the past haunted him. One of his earliest acts of vengeance was against the Temüjin clan, who had once enslaved him. When he returned, it was not with rage, but with precision. He offered freedom to those who surrendered, and punishment to those who refused. The tribes that once mocked his name began to whisper it with fear. To them he was not a boy avenging humiliation. He was a storm reclaiming its wind. Temüjin's marriage to Berta added both love and pain to his story. She was his anchor, the one who reminded him of what he fought for. But soon after their union, she was captured by a rival tribe. Temüjin gathered every ally he could, striking with a fury born not from pride but from devotion. He rescued her, yet the wound of that loss, brief but unbearable, etched itself into him forever. He learned that love itself could be stolen, that nothing was sacred in a world ruled by strength alone. It hardened his resolve. If the world was cruel, then he would remake it in his image, a world where loyalty and order would replace betrayal and chaos. His rise was not a straight climb, but a series of brutal tests. Rivals challenged him, alliances crumbled, and famine returned like an old friend. But Temüjin did not break. He adapted. Each defeat refined him, stripping away weakness, until only will remained. He began to see patterns others missed, how fear could bind men as tightly as love, how fairness could inspire greater loyalty than terror. The steppe had taught him strategy long before he learned war. To strike only when the wind was in your favor, to bend without breaking, to vanish and return stronger. Even the natural world seemed to mirror his transformation. The wind that once howled against him now moved with him. The horses that carried his tribe learned to run longer, faster. guided by riders who no longer fled from storms but became part of them. Across the plains, smoke rose from small fires, families and fugitives, whispering of a leader who spoke of unity instead of vengeance. The steppe, which had devoured countless tribes before, now began to stir with new rhythm. There were moments when even Temüjin doubted his path. At night, when the stars burned cold and distant, he would recall his father's death, his mother's weary hands, the betrayal that left him a boy among wolves. But doubt never stayed long. It had no home in him. Each dawn he woke with a deeper stillness, a mind sharpened by suffering. If the gods existed, he thought, they tested men through loneliness. And he had passed their test 1,000 times over. By the time his name began to spread across the steppes, Temüjin had already outgrown it. He was no longer a boy bound by revenge, nor a fugitive chasing safety. He had become something else, an idea. To his followers, he was the promise that order could rise from chaos, that even in a world of endless betrayal, loyalty could still be sacred. To his enemies, he was the return of the storm they thought would never come. In the silence of dawn, when mist clung to the grass and the wind moved like a living thing, Temüjin would ride alone, tracing the horizon with his eyes. There was no crown, no throne, only direction. Everything he would one day conquer still slept beyond that line of light. But within him, the empire had already begun. From the ashes of childhood emerged not a warrior, but a visionary. The world did not yet know it, but the age of division was ending. The tribes that once fought over scraps of pasture would soon ride under one banner. And the lonely child of the steppe, the boy who listened to the wind, would teach the world to fear its silence. He conquered men's hearts before he conquered their lands. Temüjin had learned from hunger that strength alone could not build anything that endured. On the steppe, blades rusted, herds died, and loyalty was as brief as a gust of wind. To create something greater than survival, he would need to forge men into a single purpose, a brotherhood strong enough to outlive him. Unity, he realized, was not given. It had to be built from the bones of fear and trust alike. When Temüjin began to gather tribes under his banner, the steppe was a patchwork of rival clans, each ruled by pride and memory. Old grudges stretched back generations, blood feuds so ancient that even the cause of hatred was forgotten. Every chieftain swore by the eternal blue sky, but few obeyed it. The world was too wide, the hunger too great. Men followed leaders for loot, not loyalty. And yet, when they met Temüjin, something in his stillness unsettled them. He did not promise gold or glory. He offered order. That was rarer than victory. He began with the smallest of gestures, fairness. When plunder was taken, he divided it equally. When disputes arose, he listened before judging. To the steppe warriors, accustomed to chiefs who ruled by whim, this was something entirely new. A leader who treated them not as tools but as brothers. Those who broke his rules were punished swiftly, regardless of rank or blood. Even his allies felt the edge of his justice. Mercy and fear walked hand in hand beside him, and men found that they respected both. In time, this balance became his greatest weapon. He formed the Anda, the Brotherhood of Oath. Warriors would kneel before him, cutting their palms and mingling their blood, a promise deeper than any treaty. These bonds were sacred. Betrayal was worse than death. Temüjin himself honored every oath he took, even those that cost him dearly. His men saw this and followed him not out of fear, but belief. In a world where trust was a forgotten language, he spoke it fluently. Still, he understood that trust without strength was fragile. To unite enemies, he had to break their illusions of power. Rival tribes who resisted were met not with negotiation, but with clarity. He struck swiftly, using tactics that blended instinct with discipline. His warriors moved as one body, each man's survival bound to the others. When the Taichi Ud, his former enslavers, defied him again, Temüjin surrounded them with silence. No cries of rage, no boasts, only the drumbeat of hooves as he closed in. When the smoke cleared, the clan that once chained him was no more. But even victory was never aimless. After each conquest, he did something none expected. He spared the families of his enemies and invited them to join his growing union. The past is ashes, he would say. The fire is ours now. He broke the cycle of vengeance by replacing it with purpose. Those who surrendered were absorbed into his ranks, bound not by heritage but by discipline. Soon, Warriors who once hunted each other now rode together under the same standard. The steppe began to hum with a strange new rhythm, less chaotic, more alive. Temujin's laws were simple but absolute. Theft, betrayal, cowardice, and arrogance, these were crimes against the unity of the tribe. Every man, regardless of birth, was subject to the same judgment. If a noble stole from a commoner, his punishment was as severe as if the roles were reversed. This equality shocked the old chieftains, but it inspired the common riders. For the first time, a man's worth was measured not by his bloodline, but by his loyalty. The world of tribes was becoming something larger, an organism with a single beating heart. He also reorganized the army into groups of tens, hundreds, and thousands, severing the old ties of family and replacing them with loyalty to command. Each man fought beside strangers, but soon found brotherhood stronger than kinship. To ensure survival, every soldier's life depended on the next. Cowardice in one meant death for all. It was a cruel logic, but a fair one. Within a few seasons, chaos had transformed into precision. The Mongols no longer looked like scattered riders, they moved like a storm. Temujin's genius lay not only in structure but in spirit. He understood the deep hunger of men to belong to something that would not betray them. Around the fires at night, he would speak softly of unity and destiny, his voice calm and measured. He told them that the steppe was one body and that its veins were their horses' paths. He reminded them that they were not fighting for pasture, but for peace, the kind that only strength could guarantee. His words were not poetry, they were prophecy. There were moments when his leadership was tested, when jealous chieftains plotted against him, or when allies doubted his methods. One rebellion, led by his former friend Jamuka, nearly shattered everything. Jamuka was charismatic and noble-born, a man who understood power but not restraint. When he captured enemies, he boiled them alive to inspire fear. Temujin, horrified by the waste, saw the difference between them. Power ruled through terror was brittle. Power ruled through justice could endure. When Jamuka's rebellion fell apart, Temujin spared those who surrendered, but executed the instigators quickly and cleanly. It was not cruelty, it was clarity. Over time, the tribes began to call him Kagan, a title whispered first in fear, then in reverence. His name became a symbol of stability in a world that had never known it. Through fairness and ferocity, he turned rivals into brothers, warriors into citizens, and chaos into rhythm. The steppe, once a battlefield of wandering tribes, had begun to breathe as one nation. Temujin never saw leadership as possession. It was a burden he carried with silent purpose. When he rode among his men, he was one of them, his armor dusted, his face weathered, his eyes reflecting the same horizon they all chased. They loved him not for his victories, but for the way he shared their exhaustion. Around every fire, stories grew. How he ate last after his men, how he gave his horse to the wounded, how his silence was more commanding than 1,000 speeches. What he built was not just an army, it was faith. The faith that unity could rise from blood, that a people divided by centuries could become one under the eternal blue sky. He had forged brotherhood not through mercy alone, but through the unyielding belief that order was worth any price. When the last great clan swore allegiance and raised his banner above the plains, a strange calm settled over the steppe. For the first time in memory, no tribe hunted another. The horizon stretched empty and still, as if the land itself exhaled. Beneath that endless blue, Temujin stood surrounded by men who had once been his enemies, their hands stained with the same blood and bound by the same promise. The tribes were united at last, and the world beyond the steppe had begun to tremble. He ruled through silence, fear, and a law no one ever wrote down. When the tribes of the steppe finally stood united beneath Temujin's banner, the question that haunted him was not how to conquer, but how to keep what he had built from collapsing back into chaos. Strength could win battles, but it could not govern men's hearts. What could bind thousands of riders, merchants, families, and conquered tribes into one pulse? For that, he turned not to the sword, but to the sky. To the Mongols, the eternal blue sky was more than a god, it was an idea. It watched everything, forgave nothing, and gave no voice. Its silence was its law. Temujin saw in that stillness a reflection of how a ruler should govern, unseen but unbreakable, vast yet constant. From this vision emerged the Yasa, a code of order that would outlive his empire. It was never carved on stone or inked on parchment. It was carried in memory, spoken by command, and enforced by consequence. No one outside his closest circle ever fully knew its breadth, and perhaps that was its strength. A law without a face cannot be destroyed. The Yasa was said to cover everything: the conduct of soldiers, the treatment of prisoners, the sharing of food, the protection of women, even the rules for mourning and celebration. It was both sacred and practical, a living compass that guided men across the endless plains. Disobedience was met not with trial, but with certainty, punishment swift and absolute. Yet behind that severity lay an invisible mercy, a promise that justice would be the same for all, no matter birth or rank. The Yasa reflected the paradox at the heart of Genghis Khan's rule: fear and fairness intertwined. In an age when kings claimed divine right and priests dictated law, Temüjin's authority flowed from the sky itself, and the people believed it. To defy the law was to defy the heavens. To obey it was to move in harmony with the world. He created not a government but a rhythm, one that turned the chaos of conquest into the discipline of civilization. His empire became a breathing machine powered by this silent order. Spies and messengers carried his decrees across distances that would take months to cross, yet the message never changed. "The sky sees," they would say, and that was enough. In markets from Samarkand to Karakoram, the same rules applied. A merchant's safety was sacred. Theft from a comrade was death. False testimony was worse than cowardice, for it poisoned trust. Even the slaughter of enemies was governed by restraint. Wanton cruelty was forbidden, unless commanded by necessity. The Yasa turned conquest into structure. Where other empires ruled through fear of the ruler, Temüjin ruled through fear of disorder. He knew that fear was temporary, but the longing for order was eternal. The law's simplicity made it immortal. It spoke not in detail but in principle: loyalty above self, honesty above gain, discipline above impulse. His soldiers repeated these words like prayers before battle. Each rider, from the humblest scout to the great generals, understood his place within a larger design. It was said that even animals fell under the Yasa's protection. To hunt without need, to waste meat, to desecrate water, these were sins against the sky. The law was not merely human, it was cosmic. It preserved the balance between man, nature, and the unseen. This philosophy, born from the wilderness, gave the Mongols a moral order far older than any civilization they conquered. Where others built temples of stone, Genghis built one of obedience and belief. Those who served him learned that silence was part of his governance. He spoke little, listened long, and judged with precision. His punishments were never impulsive, nor his rewards excessive. When two men quarreled, he asked not who was right, but which decision would preserve unity. For him, justice was not about fairness, it was about survival. In his world, the highest crime was not treason or theft, but division. The moment unity fractured, the empire would fall back into the dust from which it came. Some of his generals feared the law's weight, others found peace in it. They said the Yasa made the impossible possible, that 1,000 tribes could fight as one, that strangers could trust each other's word, that death itself seemed lighter when order was clear. Under its rule, a herder in the Altai mountains could travel safely to the markets of Persia, carrying silk and silver without fear of robbery. For a brief time, the world became smaller, and the sky above it felt larger. Even so, the law's origins remained shrouded in mystery. No scholar recorded its full text, and no successor could claim to have heard it all. Some said it was whispered to Genghis in a dream, others that he composed it in moments of solitude beside the fire. A few believed it was not created, but revealed an eternal truth drawn from the breath of the sky itself. Perhaps that was the secret of its endurance. It belonged to no man, only to the world it ordered. Through the Yasa, Genghis Khan reshaped the concept of rule itself. He proved that empire did not have to emerge from cities, temples, or writing. Civilization, he showed, could be born from the wilderness if men were willing to listen to the wind, to the silence, to the laws that required no scripture. The steppe, once thought untamable, became the foundation of a new world order. But such perfection carried its own fragility. A system built on obedience depends on memory, and memory fades. When he was gone, the law would survive in fragments, scattered across lands as vast as his conquests. Each successor would interpret it differently, some using it to preserve peace, others to justify terror. The Yasa was immortal in spirit but mortal in detail, dissolving into legend like the man who conceived it. Still, in his lifetime, it worked as no written code ever had. It bridged languages, tribes, and continents. It allowed people who had once slaughtered one another to live under the same sky, ruled by the same invisible truth. The world saw barbarism, but beneath it lay one of the purest experiments in order that history had ever known a civilization without temples, kings, or walls, bound only by faith in something vast and unseen. Under the eternal blue sky, Genghis Khan ruled not as a man but as an echo of the heavens. His law moved like wind, unseen, unending, and absolute. Those who followed it prospered. Those who defied it vanished. And as the riders of the steppe gazed upward each night, they did not see stars, they saw the law reflected back at them, endless and silent, waiting to judge all things. The stage was set. The tribes were disciplined, the empire was awake, and the world beyond the horizon had yet to learn the meaning of that silence. The horsemen who feared no city found a way to make cities fear them. For centuries, the steppe had been the wilderness beyond civilization's edge, an ocean of grass ruled by the wind. Its riders had always been dismissed as raiders, wild men who could burn a village but never build an empire. Behind their walls, the rulers of China believed themselves safe. Their fortresses rose like mountains, their gates forged of iron and arrogance. To them, the nomads were weather dangerous for a moment, then gone. But Genghis Khan was not weather. He was the change of seasons itself. When the Jin Dynasty provoked him by killing his envoys and mocking his peace, Genghis decided that the time had come to show what the steppe could learn. His armies rode eastward, through a land that had always defeated outsiders. China's northern cities were vast, fortified, and disciplined. They relied on walls taller than any man, and weapons forged in furnaces the Mongols had never seen. Yet where others saw barriers, Genghis saw opportunity. The Mongols, who had once lived by the bow and the horse alone, began to study the science of conquest. He gathered engineers, captured, converted, or recruited from the very cities he besieged. Chinese, Persian, and Khitan specialists taught the nomads how to move mountains with ropes, how to throw fire with powder, how to turn silence into strategy. Genghis was no longer simply a warrior. He became an architect of fear. When his army reached the walls of Zhongdu, the capital of the Jin, he did not rush forward. He circled the city, watching, measuring, waiting. Patience was the rarest weapon in his arsenal, and he wielded it with precision. The Mongols learned the art of siege by unlearning the habits of the steppe. They built machines that breathed smoke, and iron catapults that hurled stones the size of men, ladders that crawled like insects up the walls, and towers that reached into the sky. At night, they sent spies disguised as monks and merchants into the city, whispering terror into the hearts of its defenders. By day, they displayed prisoners on stakes, their silence a message louder than screams. The Jin generals expected chaos, but what they saw was order, an army that moved as one mind. Inside the city, panic grew like a second enemy. The people had heard of the Mongols of villages burned so cleanly that only ashes remembered them. But no one had imagined that nomads could surround a city, cut its roads, and starve it into submission. Rumors spread that Genghis spoke with the sky, that he knew the exact moment each man would die. The Jin soldiers, trapped behind walls meant to protect them, began to fear their own defenses. Every thud of a distant drum sounded like prophecy. When the siege finally began in full, the Mongols did not rely on brute force. They built canals to flood the fields, cutting the city off from its food supply. They captured enemy messengers and sent them back with false reports, sowing confusion among the ranks. They used the wind itself, setting fires that blew smoke into the defenders' lungs. The walls that had stood for generations trembled not from the stones, but from the despair that spread within. One story tells of how Genghis ordered prisoners to march ahead of his siege towers, forcing the Jin to kill their own people if they fired upon him. Another tells of how he promised safety to those who surrendered, then kept his word. Mercy and terror danced side by side, impossible to predict. Every decision was both strategy and lesson. The message was simple. Resistance was suffering, obedience, survival. Months passed. The Jin Emperor sent desperate appeals to his allies, but none came. The neighboring kingdoms feared the Mongols more than they pitied him, and in time, hunger did what arrows could not. When Zhongdu finally fell, it was not with a great battle but with a slow collapse. The gates opened to let death in. The Mongols entered the city like shadows, efficient and silent. The survivors were spared only if they submitted completely. Those who resisted vanished without trace. For Genghis, the victory was more than military, it was symbolic. The greatest empire in the East, once a beacon of stability, had been humbled by men who carried no banners but the wind. The Mongols took not just land but knowledge, siegecraft, logistics, administration. In every conquered city, Genghis ordered the preservation of artisans, scribes, and engineers. The conqueror of China was already thinking beyond conquest. Each wall he broke became a lesson in how to build his own civilization. Yet he never let his warriors forget what had made them strong. The city weakens the spirit, he was said to warn. The horse keeps it alive. Even as he adopted the tools of empire, he remained faithful to the simplicity of the steppe. Discipline was their true weapon, not machines. And discipline meant remembering that fear, once created, must be maintained. When neighboring towns saw the smoke of Zhongdu, they surrendered without a fight. The legend had begun to conquer faster than the army itself. The Jin collapse sent shockwaves across Asia. Kingdoms that had once sneered at the Mongols now sent envoys with trembling hands. Merchants, sensing safety on the roads the Mongols controlled, began to trade again. Paradoxically, from destruction came connection. The Silk Road, once a fractured artery, began to pulse with new life. Genghis had not only crushed an empire, he had reconnected the world it ruled. Among his generals, the victory cemented an unshakable belief. There was no fortress too strong, no army too disciplined, no nation too proud. What walls could not contain, the mind could dismantle. The Mongols had become more than warriors, they were architects of inevitability. Their adaptability was their genius, their patience, their power. When the campaign ended, the steppe rejoiced as if the sky itself had descended. Songs were sung of the horsemen who tamed stone, who turned the arrogance of cities into dust. But for Genghis, triumph was only another horizon. He looked westward, where greater empires waited: Persia, Khwarezm, and lands his maps did not yet name. His eyes, hardened by victory, reflected no satisfaction, only purpose. The conquest of the Jin was a beginning, not an end. It proved that the children of the steppe could rewrite the rules of war. It proved that the wind could learn to break walls. And in the silence that followed the fall of the great city, the sky over the steppe turned colder, clearer, as if it too understood what had just begun. Victory in the east had given the Mongols confidence. But beyond the horizon, the world to the west still waited, and it was not yet afraid enough. To connect the world, he first had to burn it down. The fall of the Jin Dynasty had proven that no wall could stop the wind. But Genghis Khan's vision was not content with the east. His gaze turned westward to the lands of gold and silk, of deserts and scholars, of cities older than memory. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched across Persia and Central Asia, a proud and glittering realm bound by trade and arrogance. It sat astride the Silk Roads, the lifelines of ancient commerce, where caravans carried spices, gems, and whispers from one end of the earth to the other. The Mongols sought not to destroy it, but to join it. For a moment, the world might have remained at peace, until betrayal set it on fire. In 1218, Genghis sent a caravan of merchants to the Khwarezmian city of Otrar. They came bearing gifts, seeking trade and alliance. But the governor, a man drunk on power, saw opportunity in their wealth. He accused the envoys of espionage, seized their goods, and executed them. When word reached Genghis, the steppe fell silent. No insult was greater than the murder of envoys. It was an offense not just against men, but against the sacred law of diplomacy. Genghis sent a delegation demanding justice. The Shah, proud and dismissive, beheaded one ambassador and shaved the others before sending them home. In that single act, he sealed the fate of his empire. The Mongols did not rage, they prepared. For months, their camps burned with quiet purpose. Horses were bred, arrows forged, maps drawn from memory. Genghis spoke little, but those who knew him saw a storm gathering behind his calm. "They have taken my messengers," he said, "and with them they have taken my patience." What followed was not war in the old sense, it was revelation. The steppe had found its reason to cleanse the world. In the spring of 1219, the Mongols crossed the Tian Shan mountains, descending upon the fertile lands of Transoxiana with precision and fury. Their army moved like an element of nature, fluid, silent, unstoppable. The cities of Otrar, Bukhara, and Samarkand fell one by one, each serving as both example and warning. Otrar, the site of betrayal, was razed so completely that its name became a curse whispered by merchants for generations. Bukhara, famed for its mosques and scholars, was spared from total ruin, but only so its people could witness what Genghis called the will of the eternal blue sky. When he entered Bukhara's great mosque, he dismounted and walked across its carpeted floor. Looking at the terrified crowd, he spoke softly. "If you had not committed great sins, your God would not have sent a punishment like me." His words were not shouted. They were delivered as prophecy, calm and absolute. And then he left the city to burn. But Genghis was not driven by chaos alone. Beneath the ashes of destruction lay the architecture of connection. Every city he took was stripped of corruption, but not of use. Artisans, scholars, and engineers were spared and sent eastward to serve in his growing empire. Roads were repaired, bridges rebuilt, caravans protected. The same paths that had once carried luxury now carried order. The Mongols turned conquest into infrastructure, ensuring that no merchant would ever again be robbed under their rule. In the void left by the Khwarezmian collapse, a strange new unity began to form. Still, the campaign's fury was unmatched. Samarkand, the jewel of Central Asia, fell after a siege of only weeks. Its defenders fought bravely, but their courage was met with inevitability. The Mongols encircled the city with speed beyond comprehension, cutting off all escape. When resistance continued, Genghis ordered the walls torn down stone by stone. He spared only those who could build or heal, the rest vanished into history. The Shah fled south, pursued by riders who seemed to multiply from the air. He died on a lonely island in the Caspian Sea, his empire scattered like dust in the wind. In the wake of conquest came transformation. The Silk Roads, once dangerous and divided, were now united under one authority. From China to the Mediterranean, a single empire guaranteed the safety of travel. Traders could move freely through lands that had once been fractured by centuries of war. Even as smoke rose from burned cities, caravans began to move again faster, safer, and with greater ambition than ever before. Genghis had turned fear into function. The Mongols introduced relay stations across the routes, providing fresh horses, food, and protection for travelers. Messages that once took months now moved in weeks. Ideas spread alongside goods, technologies, languages, religions, and stories carried by merchants who now swore loyalty to the Great Khan. Paradoxically, through fire came connection, through destruction, communication. The Silk Roads had never been more alive than in the shadow of their burning. And yet, this unity was not peace. It was order imposed by fear. The cities that submitted were rewarded, but those that resisted ceased to exist. Caravanserais flourished beside ruins. Trade thrived over bones. To live under Mongol rule meant to understand both the mercy and menace of stability. The empire was a paradox, open yet absolute, enlightened yet pitiless. It was civilization enforced by the memory of annihilation. Genghis knew that terror was a kind of language, and he spoke it fluently. His armies left survivors deliberately to tell the tale. When merchants passed through smoking fields, they repeated the same stories. The riders who came like thunder, the cities that fell in days, the mercy shown to those who submitted. The myth became as powerful as the sword. By the time his armies reached the Caspian, entire towns surrendered without resistance. The legend had already arrived ahead of them. But for all the devastation, Genghis's campaign westward also reshaped the world's imagination. Knowledge that had been trapped in isolated civilizations now began to circulate. Chinese engineers met Persian astronomers. Muslim mathematicians shared wisdom with Buddhist monks. Paper, gunpowder, and printing traveled westward. Medicine, astronomy, and philosophy flowed east. The empire became a living network, the first global web, spun from the ruins of kingdoms. As years passed, travelers began to notice a strange transformation. The Silk Roads, once haunted by fear, became highways of order. Where war had erased, trade restored. The fires that consumed cities also burned away the boundaries between them. Under Mongol watch, the world became smaller. In the end, the Khwarezmian Empire was not merely destroyed, it was absorbed into something larger. Its ashes fertilized the soil of global exchange. Out of betrayal came unification. Out of terror, the blueprint for globalization. Genghis had torn open the arteries of the world, and through them began to flow not only blood, but silk and stories, and the quiet hum of a planet awakening to its own connectedness. When the great Khan finally turned his gaze away from the west, he did not look back. The land behind him lay scarred, but it pulsed with new life. The Silk Roads, reborn through ruin, would carry his legacy farther than his armies ever could. They would carry whispers of his name to lands that had never seen his shadow. The Mongols had torn open the world's arteries, and from that wound, the flow of history quickened. They moved faster than news itself. Across the shifting sands of Central Asia and the jagged bones of Persia's mountains, the Mongol army advanced, not like men, but like weather. No force in history had moved so far, so fast, or so completely. Where others were slowed by terrain, the Mongols flowed across it. They carried no cities, no baggage of empire, only endurance, discipline, and the quiet precision of a machine that never broke. The world watched them appear and vanish, with the same terror one feels watching a storm form on the horizon. Beautiful, inevitable, and impossible to escape. What made them unstoppable was not merely their courage, but their order. Every rider knew his place in the rhythm of the march. The Mongol army was divided not by tribe or family, but by function groups of 10, 100, 1,000 each, able to act alone or merge into something vast. Messages could travel from the heart of the steppe to the edge of Persia faster than a bird could fly. The Yam system, their network of relay stations, spanned thousands of miles. At every stop, a fresh horse, water, and food awaited. An order whispered at dawn in Karakoram could arrive in Samarkand before the sun had fully risen twice. The desert that defeated so many became their ally. They carried little, living from the land and from the herds that followed them. Each warrior had several mounts, allowing him to switch horses mid-ride, never tiring the same animal for long. When hunger came, they cut small slits in the veins of their mares, drinking warm blood mixed with milk sustenance that required no fire, no delay. It was a world stripped to the essentials: movement, obedience, survival. The Mongol soldier was both man and instrument, tuned perfectly to his purpose. Their logistics defied imagination. Unlike other armies that dragged endless supply trains, the Mongols carried self-contained worlds. Every 100 men had their own blacksmith, their own healer, their own cook. Every 1,000 had scouts and strategists who rode far ahead, mapping terrain not by chart but by instinct. They marked the stars, the rivers, the wind, and the silence of the ground. When they crossed deserts, they followed ghost paths, ancient routes left by vanished caravans, remembered only in the songs of their elders. In Persia's heat, where other armies burned out, the Mongols seemed to grow colder. They rode by night and rested by day, navigating by starlight and memory. Even the horses learned the rhythm, moving silently across dunes as if guided by something unseen. When the enemy thought them weeks away, they would appear at the gates the next morning. They arrive before the wind, one Persian chronicler wrote. They strike before the messenger can warn us. The speed of their campaigns created a new kind of warfare, one that blurred distance and time. Cities surrendered before they were attacked, convinced that resistance was already hopeless. Armies were crushed not by numbers but by the realization that they could not outmaneuver men who never stopped. The Mongols did not march, they unfolded. One wave struck while another encircled, and another was already riding through the valleys beyond. Their communication lines, maintained by relay riders who risked death for delay, kept every general informed of the whole. It was said that Genghis could command battles hundreds of miles apart, as if he were standing in the center of each one. At the heart of this mobility was discipline. Each soldier carried his share of responsibility. No one was above the code. If one man lost his arrow, 10 replaced it. If one horse fell, 20 found water for it. Punishment for failure was severe, but loyalty to comrades ran deeper than fear. They shared hunger, cold, and sleep in equal measure. A Mongol could ride for days without food, resting his head on the neck of his horse while it galloped beneath him. He was taught to fix his own saddle, mend his own wounds, and kill without hesitation but never without reason. They also mastered deception as a form of movement. Scouts would scatter false trails, fires were lit to suggest armies where none existed, and messengers carried lies as easily as truth. Enemies often found themselves fighting shadows, chasing armies that had already passed them by. This was psychological warfare in motion, a weapon that cost nothing but time, and the Mongols spent it wisely. Even nature seemed to bend for them. Rivers were crossed with rafts made from inflated skins, mountains with paths cut overnight. When faced with impassable terrain, they disassembled their siege machines and carried them piece by piece on horseback. No obstacle remained won for long. The Mongols adapted faster than their enemies could imagine. Adaptation itself. They were not just conquerors, they were problem solvers who turned impossibility into momentum. And yet, for all their speed and precision, their advance was not chaos. Behind the fury lay a calm intelligence, an unseen hand that kept the empire's pulse steady. Genghis Khan's generals were trained to think independently, to read the land as scripture. Orders were few but clear: adapt, endure, and never lose communication. The same riders who burned cities also rebuilt bridges, restored wells, and reopened the trade routes that fed the empire's growth. Each conquest was followed not by silence, but by reorganization. Where others saw war, Genghis saw infrastructure. It was this balanced destruction and discipline that made the Mongols unstoppable. Their enemies mistook them for savages, yet the precision of their movement was mathematical. They mapped the world not on paper but in memory, turning every horizon into a coordinate of conquest. When their scouts reported a distant city, Genghis did not ask how strong its walls were. He asked how long it would take to reach it. Time itself had become a weapon, and he wielded it perfectly. Even their enemies began to admire the efficiency of their movement. A Persian chronicler, writing years after the devastation, confessed in reluctant awe. They travel as if the earth itself moves beneath them. The Mongols had become an extension of the land, its dust, its storms, its silence. Every hoofbeat was a law of nature, every breath a signal. The desert, once thought to divide worlds, had become a bridge under their command. But beneath the endless victories, time was beginning to turn. Genghis was no longer the young warrior who had chased survival through hunger and betrayal. His hair, once black as the night sky, had begun to silver. The lines on his face deepened, carved by sun and thought. He had conquered nearly everything he could see, and yet the horizon remained. His empire stretched farther than any before it, but he still rode as though something were left unfinished. The wind carried his name from the Great Wall to the Caspian, but the man himself began to listen less to the noise of war and more to the silence beneath it. For now, though, the riders still moved through desert and mountain, across frozen river and burning plain. Their speed had become myth, their discipline legend. And in the fading light of his years, the great Khan watched his army ripple across the land like a living shadow. The world had never seen such motion, nor would it again. The Mongols were unstoppable, but their leader's life was nearing twilight. He conquered the earth, but not the silence beneath it. For years, Genghis Khan had ridden like a force of nature, reshaping the world as he passed through it. Empires had fallen, trade had awakened, and the sky itself seemed to move with his will. Yet even the man who had never lost a battle could not conquer time. In the twilight of his reign, the great Khan felt the weight of his own creation pressing down upon him. His empire stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian, its borders dissolving into the unknown. Yet his gaze grew quieter, inward. He had built something that could outlast his body, but only if his death did not shatter it. And so, as with all his greatest victories, he prepared for it in silence. The exact moment of his passing is lost to history, as if the wind itself swallowed it. Some say he died in the summer of 1227, during a campaign against the Western Siar, his last rebellion to crush. Others claim he was thrown from his horse, the fall breaking his body but not his will. A few whisper that he was struck by an arrow, or poisoned by an enemy concubine, or even taken by illness, the same slow fate that humbles kings and shepherds alike. But none truly know. The Mongols did not speak of it. To them, the death of the Khan was not a fact, it was a secret belonging to the eternal blue sky. When the moment came, his commanders sealed the truth as if it were treasure. The announcement was delayed, his body hidden, his army still moving as though he lived. Messengers rode under his banner, orders were given in his name, and victory was declared in his voice. The illusion endured, because the empire depended on it. Even in death, Genghis Khan commanded absolute obedience. The soldiers believed he could not die, the land believed he could not vanish. His body was said to have been carried back to Mongolia, through deserts and mountains, under the cover of night. The procession moved without sound, no drums, no songs, no banners. Anyone who crossed their path was killed to preserve the secret. The horses that bore his coffin were later released into the wild, so that no trail would remain. His tomb, if it exists, lies somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Khenti Mountains, beneath a forest or a river, beneath perhaps nothing at all but memory. The legends that followed were many, each stranger than the last. Some said 10,000 horses trampled the earth to erase all trace of the burial. Others claimed that the river Onon was diverted to flow over his grave, sealing it forever beneath living water. There were tales of entire escorts slain upon completion of the task, so that none could speak of where the great Khan slept. Whether these were acts of devotion or fear, no one could say, but the result was perfect. In a world mapped by conquest, his final resting place became the one territory that remained unconquered. This secrecy was not accident, it was design. Genghis Khan had built his life upon the mastery of information. He understood that mystery is a kind of power. To vanish without proof was to transcend mortality. In an age obsessed with monuments, he chose the invisibility of legend. While emperors carved their faces into mountains, he left the earth unmarked. The silence of his grave became louder than any stone. For his people, death did not end his rule, it transformed it. The Mongols did not build shrines or temples for the dead, for to them, spirit was bound to the sky. They believed Genghis had returned to the eternal blue, to ride forever in the winds above the steppe. His followers spoke his name only in whispers, and his descendants swore to protect his secret as they protected his empire. The mystery became a kind of armor, a way for his memory to remain untouchable, his authority eternal. Even centuries later, when foreign kings tried to trace his tomb, the land itself seemed to resist. Expeditions disappeared into the wilderness, rumors of curses spread. Some claimed strange lights appeared over the mountains at night, others that the ground itself moved to conceal what it held. Perhaps these are only stories, shaped by awe and distance, yet they remind us of something essential, that Genghis Khan's greatest conquest was not territory but narrative. He shaped how the world would remember him, and how it never could. The absence of his grave became his final masterpiece. It left his story unfinished, always echoing. Historians can trace the paths of his armies, the laws he forged, the roads he built, but not the place where he rests. His empire was meant to be touched, measured, ruled. His death was meant to be felt, not found. The silence beneath the soil became the ultimate expression of his command, the order that no one could disobey. And so, over time, myth replaced fact. The man who had once been feared as a destroyer became remembered as a creator of order. Some saw him as a prophet of the sky, others as a punishment sent by God. In Persia, he was both demon and deliverer. In China, a unifier. In the steppe, a father whose breath was still in the wind. Every culture reshaped him into what it needed him to be. The truth, whatever it was, remained buried with him, beyond the reach of history's hand. The empire he left behind was vast and trembling, but whole. His generals and sons divided the lands into great khanates, each bound by loyalty to his memory. His dream of unity endured, at least for a time. Yet even as his heirs prepared to carry his banner farther west, a shadow lingered over them, the knowledge that the man who had bound them together was gone. The empire could still move, but its heart had stopped. Still, the wind carried his presence. On the plains where he was born, riders claimed they could hear hooves in the night, see shapes in the starlight moving just beyond the edge of vision. The eternal blue sky had reclaimed its child, but had not closed around him. The steppe remained alive with his silence. He had conquered empires, burned cities, and stitched the world together in blood and trade. But in the end, it was his disappearance that completed his legend. No tomb, no relic, no corpse, only the endless horizon, the whisper of the wind, and the knowledge that some forces do not end, they disperse. Genghis Khan had mastered everything except the silence beneath the earth. Yet even that, somehow, he made his own. His death did not diminish the Mongols, it sanctified them. His sons inherited not just a world of conquered lands, but the ghost of his will, still riding unseen across the sky. The Khan was gone, but the world still trembled where his shadow had passed. They reached Europe's doorstep, and then vanished like smoke. When Genghis Khan's breath faded into the sky, his empire did not falter. The machine he had built kept moving, as if powered by the wind itself. His chosen successor, Ögedei Khan, inherited not only the throne but the rhythm of expansion. Where his father had forged unity, Ögedei would test its endurance. The steppe, restless as ever, demanded motion. And so the riders turned west again toward the frozen rivers of Russia, the forests of Poland, and the plains that waited at the edge of Europe's fear. The new Khan was not a warrior of legend like his father, but he was a ruler of order. He understood the machinery of empire, the flow of tribute, the pulse of roads, the balance of terror and mercy. He kept the empire's heart beating from Karakorum, where envoys arrived from every corner of the known world. Yet even from that distant capital, his hand stretched outward through generals like Batu and Subutai men who had studied under the shadow of Genghis and carried his laws like scripture. In 1236, their armies surged into the forests of the Rus. The frost could break an army as easily as a sword, but the Mongols were masters of adaptation. Their horses, bred for endurance, found footing on snow and ice. Their bows sang in the cold air, their arrows striking with mathematical precision. The princes of Russia, divided and distrustful of one another, never stood a chance. Each city fell not only from force, but from the same flaw Genghis had exploited across Asia disunity. Ryazan was the first to burn, then Kolomna, Vladimir, and finally Kiev, the heart of Eastern Christendom, a city of golden domes and ancient faith. When the Mongols surrounded it in the winter of 1240, its bells rang out as though calling angels to war. But the angels did not come. For 3 days the city resisted, its defenders fighting from crumbling walls. Then, on the 4th day, the gates broke. The Mongols entered like a tide of silence. Kiev, once the pride of the Rus, was reduced to ashes and echoes. A monk who survived later wrote, "No one was left to bury the dead. The earth itself seemed tired of us." To the Mongols, these victories were not vengeance or greed, they were momentum. Each conquest was a link in a chain, stretching toward a horizon that no one yet understood. They built bridges across frozen rivers, turned forests into highways, and mapped the edges of the Western world. Their movements were too fast for rumor, too precise for comprehension. Towns learned of their destruction only when smoke appeared on the horizon, and by then, the riders were already gone. Yet even as they advanced, their discipline held. Subutai, the brilliant strategist who had fought beside Genghis himself, orchestrated every campaign like a grand game of movement and illusion. His armies split into multiple columns, moving separately across vast distances, only to reunite at the perfect moment. Their coordination defied the limits of communication. To their enemies, it seemed supernatural, an invisible design guiding the storm. By 1241, the Mongols reached the borders of Europe proper. Poland fell beneath their hooves. Hungary, caught off guard by their speed, faced annihilation at Mohi. The battle unfolded like a dark ballet. Feigned retreats, hidden flanks, a river choked with the dead. The Hungarian king barely escaped. The rest of Europe watched in disbelief. The horsemen from the east, who had been little more than rumour a few years before, now stood at the threshold of Christendom. The road to Vienna lay open. Panic spread faster than truth. Churches filled with prayers, kings fortified their castles, and the Pope called for divine intervention. But before Europe could gather its strength, the Mongols vanished. One month they were unstoppable, by the next, gone, their camps abandoned, their banners silent, no one understood why. To the terrified, it felt like a miracle. To the historians who followed, it remained one of the great mysteries of empire. The truth was simpler, yet no less haunting. News had reached them from Karakorum. Ögedei Khan was dead. By custom, every great prince of the empire was required to return for the election of a new great Khan. No campaign, however glorious, could continue without his successor. The riders obeyed the law that had bound them since the days of Genghis, the empire before ambition, the unity before conquest. They turned their horses east, their faces unreadable, leaving behind a continent trembling in disbelief. Europe mistook retreat for salvation. Priests declared it divine mercy. Kings called it providence. But it was neither. The Mongols had not been defeated. They had simply chosen to stop. Their withdrawal was not surrender. It was obedience to an order older than victory. Yet for centuries afterward, Europe would wonder what might have happened if they had not turned back. Could the world as it is have survived another season of their march? The question itself became part of the legend, the shadow of what almost was. In the aftermath, their absence felt as profound as their presence. Cities lay in ruin, kingdoms shaken, but trade routes reopened under Mongol control. The empire had redrawn maps even by leaving. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, began to form, a strange and paradoxical calm after the storm. Merchants who once feared the roads now found them safer than ever. Messengers moved freely from the Danube to the Yellow Sea, carrying letters between popes, sultans, and emperors. Out of terror came stability, out of chaos, communication. Ögedei's reign was brief compared to his father's, yet its echoes reached across continents. His leadership was pragmatic, his temper mild, his trust in order absolute. He built cities of administration, canals for commerce, and courts where Persians, Chinese, and Mongols sat side by side. Under him, the empire began to act less like a nomadic horde and more like a civilization. But this transformation carried its own peril. The farther the empire stretched, the harder it was to remember what had once bound it together. Even so, his death reminded his people of their law, that unity came before all. When his generals turned from Europe's edge and began their long journey home, they did not know they were saving the West, they were preserving the East. The empire must remain whole, or it would lose the balance that gave it power. Years later, as storytellers recalled the campaign, they spoke of the Mongols not as conquerors but as ghosts, an army that appeared without warning and vanished without trace. The peasants of Hungary swore that on quiet nights they could still hear hooves in the fields, that the wind itself carried whispers of riders who might one day return. The fear did not fade. It simply became part of the landscape. They had reached Europe's doorstep and left it trembling. They had proven that no distance was too vast, no fortress too strong. And when they vanished, they left behind not ruins alone, but the haunting knowledge that the world was smaller than it had ever imagined. Europe survived by chance, but Asia was forever changed. In the middle of nowhere, the world came together for the first time. Far from the burning cities and broken walls of conquest, in a stretch of wind-swept grassland beneath the eternal blue sky, Ögedei Khan dreamed of peace. He imagined a city that would stand not as a fortress, but as a meeting place, a heart for an empire that had outgrown the sword. To many, the idea seemed impossible. The Mongols had always been a people of movement, their power drawn from motion, their glory from conquest. Yet in the stillness of the steppe, Ögedei sought to build something that would outlast the hoofbeats and smoke. A world bound not by fear, but by exchange. He called it Karakorum. To those who first arrived, it looked like a mirage, a city rising from emptiness, its foundations laid not on rivers or stone, but on vision. There were no natural defences, no ancient walls, no sacred shrines, only open sky and endless horizon. Yet caravans began to arrive from every direction. Chinese craftsmen bearing silk and bronze, Persian builders carrying plans and dreams, Arab merchants leading camels heavy with spices, and monks from distant Europe clutching scrolls of faith. They came because the great Khan had declared the steppe sacred ground, neutral, open, untouchable. In a world torn by empires, this was the one place where peace had the protection of power. The city's design reflected its ruler's paradox. Its streets were laid in straight lines, its districts divided by trade and purpose markets, workshops, temples, and courts, all surrounding a vast central palace. Yet, the palace itself was modest, built of stone and timber, its walls carved not with triumph, but with symbols of harmony, clouds, horses, and the eternal circle of the sky. At its gates stood statues of lions and cranes, strength and peace side by side. It was as if the conqueror's soul had been split in two, half fire and half calm, both in constant dialogue beneath the open heavens. Ögedei filled Karakorum with voices from across the world. Translators and scholars were as prized as generals. Every faith was welcome. Buddhist lamas chanted beside Christian priests. Muslim astronomers shared tables with Confucian philosophers. The great Khan listened to them all, not as rivals but as parts of the same truth. It was said that when foreign envoys visited, he would pour them wine from a fountain shaped like a silver tree, a marvel of engineering built by a French artisan captured in battle. At its base, carved into the trunk, were words in Mongolian, Persian, and Latin. One sky, one world. For a brief time, it seemed the vision might hold. The roads of the empire led here like veins to a heart. Gold from the Caucasus, paper from China, medicine from the Middle East, all flowed through the capital. The Mongol Yam network, the great web of relay stations, connected the city to every frontier. Messengers could bring news from Korea or Kiev in weeks instead of months. Karakorum became the axis of a world that had never been this connected before. The Silk Roads, long broken by rival powers, now converged on the steppe in a hum of commerce and curiosity. But peace, like any empire, demanded control. Even as scholars debated philosophy in marble halls, riders on the horizon carried orders of war. Beyond the city's calm, the Mongol army still thundered westward, enforcing stability through destruction. The paradox deepened. A civilization born of conquest now fought to preserve the peace it created. Ögedei himself understood the fragility of his experiment. "The sword clears the path," he once said, "but the pen must learn to keep it open." Inside the capital, cultures mingled in ways the world had never seen. A Chinese calligrapher painted verses for a Persian astronomer. A Nestorian priest debated a Buddhist monk about the shape of the soul. Even the Mongols, once indifferent to art, began to admire craftsmanship. They learned to build with stone instead of tents, to write in many scripts, to trade rather than raid. Karakorum became a mirror of everything they had conquered, a reflection of humanity's vastness, contained within a single horizon. And yet, in that beauty lay a quiet unease. The steppe was never meant to stand still. Many of the older generals saw the city as a kind of trap, a softening of the empire's heart. They muttered that the horses were growing fat, that warriors were learning to love luxury more than the wind. Some feared that the great Khan's dream, noble as it was, would turn the children of the steppe into prisoners of comfort. They remembered the lessons of Genghis. The city weakens the spirit, and the spirit must always remain wild. Ögedei ignored such warnings, though perhaps he heard them in his sleep. He drank heavily, perhaps too heavily, and the fire that had once driven his father began to flicker. Yet even in decline, he remained devoted to the ideal of balance, the same balance that had defined the Yasa, the law of the eternal blue sky. For him, Karakorum was not a monument but a promise, that chaos could give birth to harmony, that a people who once knew only motion could learn stillness without forgetting freedom. Foreign visitors marveled at the paradox. One Persian chronicler wrote, "It is as if the world's heart beats here, where no river flows." A European envoy described the city as a miracle without miracle, a place both grand and strangely humble, where emperors dined beside blacksmiths and monks debated beneath open air. For the first time, distance itself seemed conquered not by war, but by understanding. But the dream could not last forever. The empire was too vast, its ambitions too heavy. Beyond Karakorum's peaceful walls, the future was already gathering its own storms. Rival heirs of Genghis whispered in secret. The unity of the Khanates began to strain. When Ögedei died, the city he had built would become a symbol of what the Mongols had achieved, and what they could never sustain. Still, for a brief moment in the 13th century, the center of the world lay in the middle of emptiness. Under the same sky that had watched over hunters and herdsmen for millennia, Merchants traded in a dozen languages, poets sang of distant lands, and philosophers spoke of harmony as if it were within reach. The empire that had begun in fire now glowed with the calm light of creation. Karakorum stood as proof that even conquerors could dream of peace, and though its stones would one day crumble, its idea would not. The notion that the world could meet in one place, that cultures could coexist under one sky, would echo through history long after the empire itself dissolved. The dream of unity stood, but new Khans would soon test its limits. Long before wires, the world was already wired. Across the vastness of the Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Europe, an invisible web pulsed with life. It carried no electricity, no light, no sound of machinery. Its heartbeat was the gallop of hooves. The Mongols, masters of movement, had done something no civilization before them had imagined. They had connected the world through speed. Their creation, the Yam system, was not merely a postal service. It was the nervous system of an empire. 8,000 relay stations linked by roads, horses, and men who never stopped moving. To understand its power, one must imagine the scale. The empire covered more than 30 million square kilometers, a land so immense that even light itself would seem to slow across it. And yet, under the rule of Genghis Khan and his successors, a message could travel from the Great Wall of China to the Caspian Sea in mere days. Orders from Karakorum reached generals thousands of miles away with a precision that felt supernatural. The Yam had turned distance into an illusion. Each station was a world unto itself, simple wooden huts or stone courtyards, spaced roughly 25 miles apart, each equipped with fresh horses, food, and guards. Riders arrived exhausted, dismounted, and passed their satchels to the next courier, who rode off instantly, disappearing into the horizon before the dust of the last hoof had settled. The process never stopped, not day or night, through rain or snow or silence. Some riders froze mid-journey, their bodies found still clutching the reins, but the messages continued on. To halt was treason. To deliver was devotion. The brilliance of the Yam was in its simplicity. It required no new invention, only discipline, planning, and will. The Mongols understood that an empire as fast as theirs could not survive if its words travelled slower than its armies. Each message, each seal of command, was an artery of control. They called it Ortu, meaning post or relay, and it became the empire's lifeblood. Through it flowed not just orders, but knowledge maps, trade contracts, letters of diplomacy, scientific observations, and reports from spies who rode under the same sky as merchants and messengers. Every rider carried a bronze tablet known as a paisa, stamped with the seal of the Great Khan. It was more than a badge of office, it was power itself. The paisa commanded absolute cooperation. Food, shelter, and horses were to be given instantly, without question. A man with a paisa could cross borders freely, his passage guaranteed by the authority of the sky. Even kings learned to step aside for a messenger bearing that symbol. To interfere with one was to challenge the empire itself. As the system expanded, the Mongols began to use coded signals, flags by day, fires by night to mark the routes. Smoke rose over the steppe in rhythmic bursts, visible from one station to the next, carrying silent information faster than any horse could ride. In the deserts of Central Asia, towers were built for this purpose alone, lighthouses of communication across seas of sand. For the first time in human history, a government could think in real time, its mind stretching across continents. The Yam was not merely political, it was also economic. Merchants who travelled the Silk Roads found their fortunes rising again under Mongol protection. With the same efficiency that delivered military orders, the network now carried trade permits and customs papers. Goods could move from Persia to China with a continuity unseen since the days of Rome. Caravanserais, resting inns, grew alongside the relay posts, feeding not only riders, but also the great arteries of commerce. The Mongols charged no tolls. What they demanded instead was loyalty and order. In their empire, the freedom to move was the highest privilege. Some chroniclers compared the Yam to veins beneath the skin of the world, thin, invisible lines that made the impossible possible. The entire system was kept in balance by sheer discipline. Each postmaster was responsible for the care of hundreds of horses, and each horse represented life itself. They were rotated carefully, never ridden to death. The Mongols treated their mounts as sacred tools, living instruments of unity. Even at the edges of empire, where foreign tongues and faiths divided people, the thunder of hooves reminded all that they were part of the same living network. Yet there was more to the yam than function. It carried philosophy. The Mongols believed the eternal blue sky connected all things, that movement itself was divine. To send a message across thousands of miles was to honor that sacred flow. The system became a reflection of their worldview, boundless, efficient, and alive. It symbolized what their empire stood for, not stillness, but connection. Foreign travelers marveled at its speed. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, one of the first European envoys to visit the Mongol court, wrote that he could hardly comprehend how news traveled faster than he could breathe it. Marco Polo later described it as a miracle of the age, saying that the great Khan knoweth all that is done throughout his empire, as if he were present. Even enemies could not help but admire it. To them, the yam was the most terrifying form of order, a proof that chaos itself had been domesticated. But with speed came surveillance. The same system that linked the empire also watched it. Every relay post served as an outpost of intelligence. Spies reported the movements of caravans, the whispers of governors, the moods of distant subjects. The empire became self-aware, listening to its own heartbeat. There was nowhere to hide from the Khan's gaze, not in mountain valleys, not in desert oases, not even behind monastery walls. The world had been woven into a single web of obedience. And yet, despite the fear it inspired, the yam was also a marvel of trust. Riders risked death for a scrap of parchment because they believed in the sanctity of the message. To betray that trust was unthinkable. The shame would outlast death itself. Many died nameless on frozen plains or drowned in rivers, their letters later retrieved and delivered by others who rode the same path. Their sacrifices ensured that communication never broke, that the empire could continue to think, act, and breathe as one. When one imagines the Mongols, it is easy to picture only conquest, the clash of blades, the smoke of burning cities. But their true genius lay in connection. The yam was the quiet legacy of their chaos, the invention of a global network long before the idea of nations or technology. It was the first time humanity had been bound together by information. In its design lay the seeds of future ages of postal systems, telegraphs, and the internet that now hums across the modern world. In the wind that crossed the steppes, one could still hear the faint echo of their rhythm, the endless relay of motion and message. It was a heartbeat that once spanned continents, an empire speaking to itself across time. With speed came control, and control would soon demand obedience. The roads that connected the world also carried its undoing. For the first time in human history, the continents were joined not by conquest alone, but by continuity. Across the vast spine of Eurasia stretched the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, a fragile calm maintained by speed, fear, and law. Where once there had been chaos, now there was movement. Merchants, envoys, monks, and scholars rode beneath the same sky, protected by the same seal of the great Khan. The world, long divided by mountains, deserts, and suspicion, began to hum with a single rhythm. It was a golden age of exchange, but also the beginning of its unraveling. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Roads became arteries of life once more. Caravans wound through the mountains of Afghanistan, the plains of Persia, and the forests of Russia, carrying not only silk and gold, but the breath of new ideas. Chinese engineers built water clocks in Samarkand. Persian astronomers taught geometry to monks in Beijing. Venetian traders returned to Europe with spices, fabrics, and stories that sounded like dreams. For the first time, humanity's scattered knowledge began to fuse into something greater. Everywhere, borders softened. The Mongols demanded taxes and obedience, but they also demanded openness. A merchant could cross 10 languages and a dozen kingdoms under one protection. The paisa, the bronze tablet, bearing the Khan's seal. To hold it was to belong to the largest system of trust the world had ever seen. Caravans grew larger, trade richer. Roads that had once been haunted by bandits now shimmered with safety. The empire had made the world small enough to imagine as a whole. But this web of connection was not made only of goods. It carried thought. Ideas travelled faster than armies. gunpowder moved westward, forever changing the shape of war. Papermaking and printing leapt from China to Persia, then to the Arab world, and soon to Europe. Mathematics, medicine, and philosophy crossed cultural frontiers, weaving together civilizations that had once been strangers. The Mongols, who wrote little themselves, became the couriers of humanity's collective memory. Envoys moved alongside merchants, each a thread in the tapestry of diplomacy. Christian priests arrived from Europe seeking alliances, Buddhists from Tibet carried relics and teachings, and Muslim scholars from Bukhara brought texts that redefined science. At the Mongol courts, ambassadors from every known kingdom gathered to trade not only gifts but stories. The empire became a living map of the world's imagination. In Karakorum, and later in Kunbalik, the city that would become Beijing, the great Khans hosted councils where languages mingled like rivers. Translators worked day and night, their words bridging empires that had never before spoken. Documents from these meetings show strange, almost poetic combinations of thought. Chinese ethics merged with Islamic astronomy, Greek medicine intertwined with Persian alchemy. The Mongol Empire was not merely expanding territory, it was compressing time, condensing centuries of isolation into a single, vivid moment of contact. Yet beneath this brilliance lay fragility. The very roads that made the empire strong also exposed it. Too much movement meant too little rest. The Pax Mongolica relied on perfect coordination on riders who delivered messages, governors who stayed loyal, and regions that never rebelled. But the wider the web grew, the harder it became to hold. Communication, once the source of unity, became the path of strain. Orders from the great Khan could take weeks to reach distant provinces, and by the time they arrived, the situation had changed. The web that bound the empire together began to tighten around itself. Trade, too, carried invisible risks. With every caravan came disease. From the marketplaces of China to the ports of the Black Sea, unseen passengers rode in the fur of rats and the breath of travelers. The same roads that spread wealth also spread plague. Within a generation, the connection that had made the world smaller would nearly destroy it. In time, it would reach Europe as the Black Death, a shadow of the same system that had once promised peace. The empire that had linked the earth had also linked its vulnerabilities. Still, for a moment, the beauty of that network was undeniable. Maps grew more accurate. Travelers began to see the planet as a single sphere rather than a collection of worlds. The Persian scholar Al-Idrisi drew the first near-global charts, based on reports carried by Mongol messengers. The Venetian explorer Marco Polo followed these routes and wrote of wonders that reshaped Europe's imagination. The Mongols, unknowingly, had laid the groundwork for globalization not through philosophy, but through logistics. Every city under their protection became a node in this grand web. Samarkand, with its markets of silver and lapis lazuli, Tabriz, where Arab and Indian traders argued over spices, Kashgar, the hinge between east and west, and Karakorum, the empire's quiet pulse in the steppe. The Yam network, the postal system of relays, was their invisible thread. It carried letters of state, trade permits, maps, and rumors. The same paths that brought wealth to merchants also brought wisdom to scholars and strategy to generals. The Mongols had created a world that could think as one. The great irony was that this harmony had been built on fear. Merchants traveled safely because they feared Mongol reprisal more than thieves. Scholars spoke freely because their patrons ruled with absolute power. The empire's peace depended on tension, a delicate balance between trust and terror. It worked, while the central authority remained strong. But empires, like networks, fail not from outside attack, but from within. The same speed that connected them would one day carry rebellion, miscommunication, and ambition faster than loyalty. As decades passed, the unity that had once seemed eternal began to fracture. Local governors hoarded wealth, generals carved personal kingdoms from conquered soil. The four great khanates, Golden Horde, Ilkhanate, Chagatai, and Yuan, grew apart in culture and ambition. Messages between them still flowed, but meanings began to blur. The world's first global web, so carefully woven, began to tear at its edges. And yet, its echoes endured. The knowledge it spread could not be unlearned. When the empire faded, its roads remained, its bridges still crossed rivers, its maps still hung in the minds of explorers. Even the memory of its efficiency haunted those who came after. The world had tasted connection, and it would never again be content with isolation. The Pax Mongolica was a paradox, a golden peace born from violence, a unity destined to unravel. It had turned the chaos of conquest into the symmetry of communication, only to discover that order too has a breaking point. In the glow of trade and learning, the seeds of decline were already growing. Too much connection, too little restraint. The same web that joined continents would soon catch the empire itself. For now, though, the roads still shone under the sun. From Venice to Xi'an, the caravans rolled, the monks prayed, the merchants counted their coins. The great Khan's dream still lived in motion, in the hum of hooves and the whisper of silk in desert winds. But the harmony of the world is always temporary. Beneath the beauty of the network, the threads had begun to strain. The web of empire was tightening, and soon it would begin to tear. He built a throne so high, it forgot the ground beneath it. By the time Kublai Khan rose to power, the Mongol Empire had already stretched across the spine of the world. It had outgrown the steppe, outgrown even the dreams of his grandfather, Genghis Khan. What began as a movement of riders beneath the open sky now sought permanence: stone walls, palaces, gardens, and silk. Kublai was the grandson of conquest, but his ambition was not to burn the world, it was to rule it. He wanted not the fear of his name, but its reverence. And to achieve that, he would trade the saddle for the throne. When Kublai looked south toward China, he saw not an enemy, but a mirror, a civilization vast, ancient, and orderly. To the Mongols, China had always been both prize and paradox. It was everything the steppe was not: settled, soft, and rich beyond measure. Genghis had conquered its northern dynasties, but Kublai sought something more enduring: legitimacy. To rule China meant becoming part of its story, to replace its emperors not as conqueror, but as successor. And so, he began to reshape himself in its image. He built his capital near the ruins of Zhongdu, the city once burned by his grandfather, and called it Khanbalik, the city of the Khan. It would later be known as Beijing. There, he constructed a court that defied imagination. Golden roofs, marble bridges, courtyards wide enough to hold armies, and halls where incense curled upward like the breath of gods. Poets wrote of its splendor, describing it as the meeting place of heaven and earth. Yet in its magnificence lay a quiet contradiction. The more the empire glittered, the farther it drifted from the simplicity that had made it strong. Kublai's rule was one of contrasts. He was both Mongol and emperor, warrior and scholar. He wore silk robes but still carried the memory of the steppe in his voice. His palace resounded with the songs of foreign musicians, his libraries filled with scholars from Persia, India, and Europe. The Venetian traveller Marco Polo would later write of this court as if describing another planet, a realm of wonders, where elephants carried gold, paper money, replaced coins, and ships larger than cities sailed on distant seas. Under Kublai's reign, the empire's heart moved from the saddle to the scroll. He embraced the Chinese bureaucracy, expanding its systems of governance and taxation. Roads and canals multiplied, granaries filled, and trade flourished. The Yuan dynasty became a marvel of administration, connecting east and west in a harmony no one had thought possible. Under his protection, the Silk Roads thrived once more, and merchants from Venice to Samarkand found safe passage under Mongol banners. It seemed, for a time, that the world had finally settled into peace. But peace carries its own kind of danger. The Mongols, once united by struggle, now found themselves divided by comfort. The steppe warriors, who had conquered half the earth with little more than leather and discipline, now wandered through marble corridors wearing silk slippers. Many resented the transformation, calling Kublai a traitor to the old ways. The fire of the plains, they whispered, has turned to ash. The eternal blue sky, once their god of freedom, now hung above tiled roofs and perfumed gardens, unseen and unremembered. Kublai himself sensed the change, though he did not fear it. He believed civilization was another form of conquest, one of the mind rather than the sword. He invited philosophers, scientists, and artists from every corner of his empire. He studied Buddhism and Confucianism, blending Mongol pragmatism with Chinese thought. His rule became a tapestry woven from opposites: discipline and indulgence, conquest and contemplation. But no tapestry, however intricate, can stretch forever. As he adopted the customs of the Chinese court, he alienated the Mongols who had followed him through war. They saw in his luxury a betrayal of their ancestors' simplicity. The generals of the steppe began to drift back toward the open plains, muttering that the Khan no longer spoke the language of the wind. Meanwhile, the Chinese subjects he ruled viewed him as foreign, a barbarian wearing the mask of an emperor. He belonged fully to neither world. And yet, in this fragile balance, Kublai achieved a fleeting brilliance. Under his command, China prospered. New irrigation systems turned barren fields to gold. Cities swelled with merchants and scholars. The Mongol administration introduced paper currency, connecting economies across continents. Trade ships sailed from Chinese ports to India, Arabia, and Africa, carrying porcelain, spices, and dreams. The world was, for a moment, whole. But even perfection demands a price. The wealth that flowed into Kambalik began to pool rather than circulate. Bureaucrats grew powerful, corruption crept quietly into the empire's veins, and Kublai's once fluid rule hardened into ceremony. He still rode occasionally through the steppe, seeking solace beneath the open sky, but he found only distance. The land of his forefathers felt foreign now. The silence that had once been sacred now sounded like loss. He grew old, surrounded by splendor, art, wisdom, and the illusion of control. Yet his heart remained haunted by the simplicity of his grandfather's dream, a world united not by palaces, but by purpose. Kublai had built something magnificent, but in doing so, he had also built walls between himself and the spirit of the steppe. His empire was no longer a camp that could move with the wind, it was a palace bound to the earth, heavy with its own grandeur. As the years passed, cracks appeared. The distant khanates, once loyal, began to act as independent kingdoms. Communication faltered, borders strained, and rebellions stirred beneath the surface. The empire's size, once its pride, became its burden. Kublai, who had dreamed of harmony, found himself surrounded by echoes of discontent. His generals fought wars in distant lands he would never see. His bureaucrats governed provinces he could barely imagine. In his final years, he became a ghost within his own creation. He wandered his palace at night, speaking softly to portraits of ancestors who had lived and died in tents. "We built a mountain," he is said to have murmured, "but forgot the wind that made us climb." And so, beneath the golden roofs of Kambalik, the Mongol spirit began to fade. The empire that had once been a storm was becoming a monument. It glowed with brilliance, but its pulse slowed with each passing year. Kublai's vision of peace and prosperity was real, but it was also heavy, fragile, and rooted in soil that had never known how to stand still. He had turned nomads into kings, warriors into administrators, conquest into civilization. It was the greatest transformation the steppe had ever seen, and perhaps its most dangerous. China flourished under Kublai Khan, its people enriched, its scholars empowered, its roads alive with trade. But far to the north, across the empty plains and the frozen rivers, the steppe remembered what it had lost. The wind still carried the songs of riders who had once conquered the world, and now wondered if the world had conquered them in return. The empire that connected the world could not stay connected to itself. It began, as empires often do, not with rebellion but with inheritance. When Genghis Khan died, he left behind not a kingdom but a principle, the idea that the world could be ruled as one. His sons and grandsons inherited that vision, but also the impossible task of maintaining it. The empire had grown too vast, its pulse spread across too many horizons. For a time, the illusion of unity held under Ögedei and Kublai, bound by the memory of their grandfather's shadow. But shadows lengthen as the sun sets, and by the 14th century, the Mongol world began to fracture into 4 great pieces, each reflecting a different face of the same lost dream. They called them the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan Dynasty. 4 heirs of one destiny, 4 mirrors of one fading sky. To the northwest rose the Golden Horde, sprawling across the steppes of Russia and Eastern Europe. Its capital, Sarai, glimmered on the banks of the Volga River like a mirage of gold and smoke. There, Mongol rulers lived among Slavic princes, adopting the rhythms of the land they had conquered. They collected tribute from Moscow, Kiev, and countless smaller towns, their power felt in every toll of the church bell. Yet over time, the horde became less Mongol and more local. They embraced Islam, married into Turkic and Slavic families, and built cities instead of tents. Their warriors still rode beneath banners of black and gold, but their souls had begun to settle. The wind of the steppe had been replaced by the weight of empire. To the southwest, in the deserts and valleys of Persia, emerged the Ilkhanate, a dynasty that shimmered with contradictions. Founded by Hulagu, grandson of Genghis, it had been born in fire. Hulagu's conquest of Baghdad in 1258 marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, one of Islam's greatest dynasties. The city that had once been the heart of the Muslim world burned for days, its libraries turned to ash, its scholars silenced. Yet, within a generation, the conquerors had become patrons. The Ilkhans converted to Islam, rebuilt the cities they had destroyed, and filled their courts with poets, astronomers, and architects. Under their rule, Persian art flourished anew, infused with Mongol symmetry and imagination. In their paradox, they mirrored the empire itself, destroyers who had learned how to create. To the heart of Central Asia lay the Chagatai Khanate, stretching from the snow of the Pamirs to the sands of the Tarim Basin. It was named for Chagatai, the second son of Genghis, a man known for his discipline and severity. His descendants carried his rigidity forward, enforcing the old Mongol laws long after the others had drifted. The Yasa, the ancient code of the eternal blue sky, still ruled here. Yet even this stronghold of tradition began to change. Islam seeped slowly into its courts, its markets filled with Persian and Indian merchants, its language blending Turkic, Mongol, and Arabic into something new. It was here that Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, would later rise, claiming to revive the old Mongol order, even as he reshaped it into something far bloodier. And to the east, in the heart of China, stood the Yuan dynasty, Kublai Khan's great experiment. It was the most powerful and the most fragile of the four. In its palaces, the dream of unity lingered a little longer. Scholars and monks debated in marble halls, merchants from the west still arrived through guarded gates, and the roads of empire still thrummed with motion. But the Yuan, for all its splendor, was trapped between two worlds, Chinese in structure, Mongol in soul. To its people, the rulers from the steppe remained outsiders. Revolts simmered beneath the silk and gold, and whispers of rebellion grew louder as drought, famine, and corruption spread. The fire that had once fueled conquest now smouldered into decadence. 4 khanates, 4 directions, each born of the same lineage, each reflecting a different truth. Together, they formed a map of transformation from movement to settlement, from conquest to culture. What had once been one beating heart became 4, each pulsing to its own rhythm. For a time, they coexisted uneasily. Trade still flowed along the silk roads, messengers still rode from one Khan's court to another, and the old alliances flickered like embers in a dying fire. But the balance could not hold. Distance turned to distrust, cooperation to competition. The Khans began to see one another not as brothers, but as rivals. Armies that once shared the same banners now faced each other across borders that no one had intended to draw. The empire that had connected the world could no longer connect itself. Religion deepened the divides. The Golden Horde followed Islam. The Ilkhanate drifted between Islam and Buddhism before settling into faith. The Chagatai remained torn between shamanic traditions and reform, and the Yuan clung to the cosmopolitan tolerance of Kublai's reign. Where once the Mongols had ruled above all creeds, they were now ruled by them. The eternal blue sky, once their unifying god, faded into metaphor, a relic of a simpler time. Even their languages began to diverge. The Mongol tongue fractured into dialects, each absorbing the sounds of foreign lands. Their scripts changed, their art evolved, their sense of shared identity eroded like wind over stone. The empire had taught the world how to connect, but could not keep its own roots from splintering. The irony was haunting. The very success that had made them world rulers, adaptability became the seed of their undoing. Each Khanate adapted too well to its own environment, becoming local, familiar, and less Mongol with every generation. The Golden Horde became Rus, the Ilkhanate became Persia, the Yuan became China. What had been universal dissolved into the particular. The sky that had once stretched unbroken across Eurasia was now reflected in 1,000 fragments of glass. And yet, even in their division, their legacy endured. The systems they built, roads, laws, languages, and diplomacy, continued to knit continents together long after their banners disappeared. The Mongols had proven that humanity could be connected by more than blood or faith. It could be united by exchange, communication, and movement. The dream outlived the dreamers. In the chronicles of history, the fall of the Mongol Empire is often written as tragedy. But perhaps it was also fulfillment. Nothing that grows endlessly can remain whole. What began as a storm had become rain spread across the world, nourishing what it once destroyed. In the courts of Europe, the libraries of Persia, the temples of China, and the marketplaces of Samarkand, the memory of the Mongols lived on not as conquerors, but as connectors. By the end of the 14th century, the unity of the steppe was gone. The riders who had once carried the laws of the eternal blue sky now served kings and sultans. The dream of one empire under one sky had faded into legend. And yet, the silence of the steppe was not empty, it still whispered of what had been. The horses were gone, but the roads remained. The empire had dissolved into the very world it had created. The echo of the Mongols was fading, but it would not vanish. Their empire vanished, but the world kept running on its memory. When the Mongol Empire finally dissolved into dust, it left no marble monuments or immortal capitals, only the quiet endurance of its ideas. Unlike the empires of Rome or China, the Mongols did not carve their legacy into stone. They carved it into systems. Roads, rules, habits of exchange, and ways of thinking. These became their true inheritance to the world. Long after their banners disappeared from the horizon, the world they once unified continued to move as if guided by their unseen hand. Across Eurasia, the aftershocks of their innovations were still rippling outward. Empires rose where their armies had once ridden, each borrowing something of the Mongol design order through communication, flexibility through fear, tolerance through power. The Mongols had built no temples to themselves, yet they had rewritten how humanity organized its reach. In the Ottoman Empire, born centuries later at the western edge of Asia, echoes of Mongol governance still hummed beneath the surface. The Ottomans inherited not only the lands once crossed by Mongol horses, but also their understanding of control through connection. The Ottoman courier system, their relay routes and military roads, were direct descendants of the Mongol yam. Orders from Istanbul could reach distant borders in weeks, just as once they had from Karakorum. Their cavalry tactics, the circling maneuvers, the feigned retreats, the use of mounted archers carried the unmistakable rhythm of the steppe. Even their administrative genius, the Timar system of land grants in exchange for loyalty, echoed the Mongol balance between discipline and reward. In Russia, the Mongol shadow was darker but deeper. For over 2 centuries, the Golden Horde ruled the Slavic principalities, reshaping them from loose alliances into a centralized hierarchy. Moscow, once a tributary town, learned from its conquerors how to govern. The very idea of autocracy, the Tsar as absolute ruler, wielding divine and temporal power, was sharpened under Mongol influence. Taxation, census-taking, and communication systems all carried the logic of the steppe: efficiency, surveillance, and obedience. The Russians hated their masters, yet absorbed their methods. By the time Moscow rose to cast off the horde, it had become the new empire of the north, an heir not in name, but in structure. The Mongols had taught them that rule required reach, and reach required control. In Europe, the Mongols were remembered as terror, and yet, quietly, they transformed the continent's imagination. Their conquests had opened the roads eastward, pulling Europe out of isolation. Merchants from Venice and Genoa followed the routes the Mongols had secured, their caravans laden with silk, porcelain, and spices. Ideas flowed with them: mathematics from Persia, paper and printing from China, navigational maps from the Muslim world. The Pax Mongolica had made possible the global curiosity that would, centuries later, spark the Renaissance. Even fear had its uses. In their struggle to understand the Mongols, Europeans began to study geography, languages, and diplomacy on a scale they never had before. The unknown world was no longer a myth, it was a destination. Religious tolerance, one of the Mongols' most radical policies, also survived in quieter forms. Though often remembered as destroyers, they were among the first rulers to codify the idea that belief could coexist under one law. Their courts hosted Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and shamans side by side. In Persia, this idea endured through the Ilkhanate's policies and later influenced the pluralism of the Ottoman state. Even in Europe, where religious wars would rage for centuries, the faint memory of Mongol impartiality persisted among diplomats and scholars. The empire that had demanded loyalty above creed had introduced the notion, however faint, that governance need not depend on faith. Their influence extended even to the battlefield long after their warriors were gone. The Mongol emphasis on speed, mobility, and intelligence reshaped warfare itself. Their methods of reconnaissance, psychological warfare, and coordination through signals became the blueprint for later armies. The Ottomans, the Mughals, and even the early Russian cavalry borrowed their logic. Strike fast, vanish faster, rule through precision, not numbers. The Mongols had made warfare into an art of geometry, a moving design on the face of the earth. But perhaps the greatest inheritance they left was the idea of global connection. Long before the word globalization existed, the Mongols had lived it. They envisioned a world where goods, people, and knowledge could move freely under one authority. Their empire had been the first to imagine the earth as a single, knowable whole. When it collapsed, that vision did not die, it simply dispersed. Traders carried it, map-makers drew it, and kings dreamt of it. Centuries later, when explorers set sail seeking new routes to Asia, they were, unknowingly, chasing echoes of Mongol pathways. Even their postal system, the yam, found afterlives in places they had never touched. European couriers adopted the idea of relay communication. The word post itself, some historians suggest, is a linguistic descendant of Mongol roots. Every government that sought to know its lands faster, every empire that tried to hold itself together through message and motion, was following the Mongol logic of connectivity. And yet, their legacy was not only one of order. The same networks that spread trade also spread disease. The Black Death, carried along the roads they had opened, devastated the world they had connected. From China to Italy, it followed the same arteries that once pulsed with silk and letters. The Mongols had unified the planet's body, but they had also revealed its vulnerabilities. Connection, they had shown, was both creation and contagion. In their ruins, new civilizations rose. The Ottomans in the west, the Mughals in the south, the Ming in the east, all borrowed something from the Mongol design. The Mughals, descendants of Timur who claimed lineage from Genghis, built their empire on the same foundation of tolerance and efficiency. The Ming rebuilt China on Mongol administrative patterns, even as they erased their memory from its walls. Everywhere the Mongols had passed, the air still vibrated with their rhythm, the movement of messengers, the hum of marketplaces, the balance of terror and peace. Yet few remembered their names with reverence. History tends to reward builders of stone, not builders of systems. Their palaces had turned to dust, their capitals forgotten beneath grass. But their ideas had become invisible architecture, the unseen structure of the modern world. Each time a plane crosses a continent in hours, each time a message travels across the globe in seconds, it is part of the same dream the Mongols once rode into existence, that the world could be connected as one. Theirs was an empire that ended without an ending. Its borders vanished, but its rhythm endured in trade routes, in philosophies of rule, in the very concept of speed itself. The Mongols had once ruled through motion, and even in their absence, the world kept moving. The empire was gone, but its ideas had become the world's foundation stones. And as centuries passed, those ideas began to transform again from living systems into stories, from policies into myths. The riders of the steppe faded into legend, their hooves echoing not in the earth, but in the imagination. From ideas to myths, the Mongols would soon step from history into eternity. When history ends, myth begins, and sometimes myth lasts longer. Empires die in battlefields, but legends are born in silence. The Mongol Empire, once the greatest force the world had ever seen, left behind no ruins to wander, no marble cities to remember it by. Its palaces were made of tents, its temples of wind. And yet, as centuries passed, the memory of the Mongols did not fade, it multiplied. In their absence, the world filled the void with stories. What could not be explained became myth. What could not be forgiven became fear. In Europe, their name became a whisper that children were taught to dread. The Tatars, as they were known, were said to have come from the mouth of hell itself. Chroniclers describe them as monsters with the bodies of men and the hearts of beasts, born of the wilderness, eating flesh, drinking blood, killing for sport. Priests called them the scourge of God, divine punishment for the sins of mankind. In the churches of Hungary and Poland, murals showed horsemen with burning eyes and hooves of iron, their arrows guided by demons. For centuries after their departure, peasants still claimed to hear hooves on quiet nights, as if the riders would return with the next thunderstorm. To the Russians, the Mongols became both tormentors and teachers. Their rule was remembered as a time of humiliation, yet also as the crucible from which Russia's destiny was forged. The Tatar yoke, as it was called, shaped the Russian spirit into something both resilient and fatalistic. The fear of invasion became part of the nation's soul, but so did the memory of unity under pressure. The Mongols became ghosts in Russian history, never fully gone, never fully forgiven. In Persia, the Mongols were remembered with more ambiguity. The Ilkhanate had burned Baghdad to ash, ending centuries of Islamic scholarship. Yet within a few generations, their descendants had rebuilt it with beauty and learning. Persian poets wrestled with the contradiction. Some cursed the Mongols as destroyers, others saw them as instruments of renewal, sent by fate to cleanse a decaying world. Out of ruin comes order, one scholar wrote, and from the fire of their hooves came a new dawn. The Mongols had become a mirror for divine mystery, half curse, half revelation. In China, their memory softened into reverence and resentment intertwined. The Yuan dynasty had fallen, replaced by the Ming, yet Kublai Khan's grandeur could not be erased. He lingered in legend as a philosopher king, a ruler who united heaven and earth. His court became the setting for fables of wise ministers, immortal artisans, and secret treasures buried beneath the forbidden city. The Mongols had entered the Chinese imagination not as barbarians, but as symbols of cosmic transformation. Chaos giving birth to harmony, fire giving way to order. Further east, in Japan, where the Mongols had twice attempted invasion and failed, their legend took another shape. The divine wind, the kamikaze, that had destroyed the Mongol fleets, became sacred. The storms were seen as heaven's intervention, proof that even the most powerful empire could be humbled by nature. The Mongols became the measure of divine justice, the invincible force that proved the gods still watched over the islands. And on the steppe, where their story had begun, the Mongols never became legend. They remained memory. Their songs survived in fragments, carried by wind and time. Elders spoke of the days when the sky itself followed the Khan's command, when the herds were vast and the land endless. For them, the empire had not vanished. It had simply gone to sleep. The eternal blue sky still watched, and the riders, they believed, would one day return. Their graves unmarked, their leader's tomb unfound, the Mongols were suspended between life and myth, neither lost nor living, only waiting. Every civilization they had touched remembered them differently, reshaping the same truth into a reflection of its own fears and desires. In the West, they were apocalypse. In the East, enlightenment. In the steppe, eternity. The Mongols had transcended history by becoming its contradiction, an empire that vanished yet remained everywhere. Part of their myth endured because of mystery. Genghis Khan's burial site, still undiscovered, became a magnet for imagination. Some said it lay beneath a river, others that it was hidden under the roots of a sacred mountain. Legends told that 10,000 horses had trampled the earth flat to conceal it, that all who buried him were executed to preserve the secret. Over time, these stories became parables, symbols of power that could not be contained by death. He sleeps beneath the sky, they said, and the earth itself guards him. Even in silence, he ruled. Artists, centuries later, painted him as a god of destiny, a man who had bent the elements to his will. In Europe, he was Lucifer's general. In Asia, a vessel of heaven's will. The truth was buried beneath both, but perhaps that was fitting. The Mongols themselves had always moved in the space between worlds, between faiths, between cultures, between life and legend. They had never belonged to one story, so history gave them all of them. Even their name began to change meaning. Tartar, in Latin, became Tartarus, a word for hell. Mongol in Persian poetry came to mean wild spirit. In China, the term for Great Khan became synonymous with heaven's son. They were no longer men, but archetypes, symbols of divine wrath, cosmic justice, and human ambition. But the most haunting legacy of all was how easily they slipped between truth and myth, how their memory adapted like their empire once had. Every generation reinvented them. Kings invoked their power, rebels borrowed their names, poets dreamt of their return. The Mongols had become an idea, a force that transcended time and geography. To speak of them was to speak of the limits of civilization itself, how easily it can be undone, and how strangely it can be reborn. Even modern nations, centuries later, could not resist their pull. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan became a symbol of pride, his face printed on money, his name whispered with reverence. In the West, he became a paradoxical icon, half monster, half visionary, representing both the terror and brilliance of the human will. History could no longer define him, only myth could. Yet beneath all the legends, beneath the gold and fear, the songs and prayers, something quieter endures. The Mongols had lived by motion, by the belief that the world was one continuous horizon. In their myth, that motion never stopped. The wind still carries their memory across the plains, the same wind that once carried their armies and their dreams. When history ends, myth begins. And sometimes, myth is not false. It is simply what remains when the truth becomes too vast to remember. The Mongols had conquered nations, but it was in memory that they conquered time. The myth endures, but truth lies buried beneath it. The world they conquered finally conquered them. There was no final battle, no great surrender. The end of the Mongol world did not arrive with fire, but with stillness. Across the endless grasslands, where once the thunder of hooves had shaken continents, the wind began to move alone. The riders who had ruled from the Pacific to the Danube had not been defeated in war, they had been overtaken by time. The steppe, which had birthed empires from nothing, was falling silent. As the centuries turned, new powers rose to fill the spaces the Mongols had once bridged. In the east, the Ming dynasty drove out the last remnants of the Yuan, sealing the Great Wall once more against the north. The empire that had once opened every road now built walls to close them again. In the west, the Ottoman Turks forged a new vision of power, a settled, administrative world of cities, faith, and permanence. And to the north, the Russian Tsars, once tributaries of the Golden Horde, began to push outward across the same steppes that had once enslaved them. Slowly, the lands of the horsemen were surrounded by empires of stone. The transformation was subtle at first. The old clans still roamed the plains, still hunted and herded as they always had. But the rhythm had changed. The borders of empires crept farther into the steppe each year. Taxes replaced tribute, governors replaced khans. Where the Mongols had once lived in motion, their descendants found themselves penned by politics. The open world that had defined them the horizon without end was shrinking. To the Ming, the nomads were a threat to be contained. Massive walls and fortified passes turned the fluid border into a prison of geography. The Mongols, who once rode freely across China's plains, were forced into trade caravans, their horses exchanged for silver, their independence for permission. The Great Wall, rebuilt and extended under Ming rule, became both a symbol and a tomb, the dividing line between the world that moved and the world that stayed still. In the west, the Ottoman Empire absorbed the Mongols' spiritual cousins, the Turkic horsemen who had once shared their way of life. Steppe warriors became soldiers in imperial armies, their freedom traded for rank and coin. The Ottomans adopted the Mongols' efficiency, but not their wildness. Their empire was disciplined, bureaucratic, and permanent. The age of the rider had given way to the age of the administrator. The nomad's song was replaced by the scribe's pen. But it was in Russia that the final echo of the Mongol spirit lingered the longest. For 2 centuries, the Golden Horde had ruled over the Russian lands, shaping their governance and their will. When the Russians broke free, they did not destroy the Mongol model, they absorbed it. The Tsars ruled with the same absolute authority once held by the Khans. The riders of the Horde, now fragmented and weakened, found themselves under new masters who spoke their language of power, but not of freedom. In time, the Russians became the new steppe conquerors, pushing east across Siberia, carrying empire into lands that had once belonged to the wind. The Mongols had taught them how to rule vast distances, and they used that knowledge to erase the very people who had given it. By the 15th century, the Great Steppe itself, once the heart of the world, had become a borderland. The caravans that crossed it now belonged to merchants, not warriors. The great herds dwindled. Tribes fractured or assimilated into neighboring empires. Some became mercenaries, their loyalty sold to the highest bidder. Others became myths, fading from the maps that no longer needed to mark their migrations. The sky remained vast, the grass eternal, but the meaning of both had changed. The horizon no longer promised destiny, it promised disappearance. The tragedy of the steppe was not defeat, but absorption. The Mongols had built a world of motion, but the world they built learned to move without them. Trade continued. Roads flourished. Armies still followed their patterns of discipline and communication. But the people who had invented those systems became strangers in their own creation. Their inventions had outlived their identity. The empire that once defied boundaries had taught the world to draw them better. In the quiet that followed, memory became the last refuge of freedom. Among the remaining nomads, stories replaced history. They sang of the days when the sky had answered their ancestors' prayers, when horses outran time and men commanded the wind. The names of Genghis, Kublai, and Subutai became sacred, not as rulers, but as symbols of what had been lost. "We are the children of the horizon," they said, but the horizon has moved away. The transformation of the Mongols from conquerors to subjects was not simply political, it was spiritual. The eternal blue sky, once their god and witness, now belonged to no one. The temples of the settled world rose higher than the clouds, blocking the sight of the heavens. The steppe, once the axis of existence, had become a whisper at civilization's edge. It was as if humanity had turned its back on the open world, preferring the certainty of walls to the promise of wind. Even nature seemed to follow. The great migrations of the herds thinned. The grasslands gave way to farmland and settlement. Roads that had once carried messengers now carried taxes and soldiers. The steppe was no longer infinite. It had been measured, mapped, and domesticated. Its silence was no longer freedom. It was erasure. And yet, in that erasure, something remained. The Mongols had always believed that the sky was eternal and that the spirit of the rider could never die. When the wind moves across the plains of Mongolia, it still carries the rhythm of hooves, the faint echo of an empire that once stretched across the world. The people who remain herders, wanderers, descendants of forgotten tribes still bow to the horizon at dawn, as their ancestors did. They do not remember every name, but they remember the feeling that the world once belonged to movement. The world they conquered had learned their lessons well. It became faster, more connected, more controlled. The principles of the steppe mobility, communication, adaptability had been absorbed into civilization itself. But the price of that absorption was the death of the wild. The steppe no longer led the world forward. It had become the ghost of what progress had consumed. By the dawn of the modern age, the last of the Mongol Khanates had fallen. The Golden Horde fractured into ash. The Yuan dynasty was long gone. The Ilkhanate vanished into Persian dynasties, and the Chagatai faded into Timur's empire before disappearing altogether. The legacy of the steppe lived only in traces words in foreign languages, customs buried in culture, roads that still followed invisible paths first laid by horsemen centuries ago. The wind that once carried armies now carried only grass. The fire of the steppe had burned through the world, and having nothing left to conquer, went out. The Mongols had once believed that the sky and the earth were bound by motion, that stillness was death. And so, when their movement ended, a part of the world's soul seemed to dim with it. The endless plain remained, but the heartbeat beneath it had gone silent. The world they conquered finally conquered them. And now, only the wind remembers. The story turns reflective. What does it mean when movement itself dies? He erased his own grave to prove nothing can last forever. For 8 centuries, the resting place of Genghis Khan has remained hidden, one of the greatest mysteries in all of history. Empires have risen and fallen, satellites have mapped the earth, and yet no one has found the spot where the man who changed the world was laid to rest. His tomb is not merely a secret, it is a statement. Even in death, Genghis Khan commanded silence. According to legend, when the great Khan died in 1227, his followers carried his body back to Mongolia in total secrecy. The journey was long across deserts, rivers, and mountains guarded by soldiers who would never return. Some stories say the caravan killed anyone who saw them, sealing the route with blood. Others whisper that 1,000 horses were ridden over his burial site to flatten the earth, erasing every sign that a grave had ever existed. It was as if the earth itself was ordered to forget. The chronicles are vague. Some say he died in China, others in the mountains near the Onon River, his birthplace. A few claim that he asked to be buried where he first saw the sky as a child. But no record, no map, no stone, no word was left to confirm it. His burial was not a ritual of remembrance, but an act of disappearance. The Mongols believed that death should not disturb the living world. To reveal a grave was to break the harmony between earth and spirit. A tomb, in their eyes, was not a monument, but a prison for memory. Genghis Khan, who had conquered everything visible, chose invisibility as his final conquest. He who had unified the horizon now returned to it, leaving behind no monument, no empire, only an idea. Centuries later, explorers and emperors tried to find him. The Manchus, the Russians, the Japanese, even modern archaeologists with satellites and drones all have searched the valleys and plains of northern Mongolia. They found bones, camps, fragments, but never the tomb. Some claim it lies beneath Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain where Genghis once prayed to the eternal blue sky. Others believe his body was buried beneath a diverted river, its waters rerouted to conceal the grave forever. A few insist that his tomb was a false trail, that his remains were cremated and scattered so that no one could claim his soul. Each theory adds another layer to the myth, but the mystery remains whole. The silence of the steppe guards him still. Mongolian elders often say that those who search for his tomb disturb not the dead, but the balance between worlds. The sky hides what it chooses, they say, and the Khan was chosen by the sky. What makes this mystery endure is not the hope of discovery, but the power of absence. Genghis Khan's unseen grave has become more than a location, it is a symbol. It reminds us that even the greatest lives vanish, and that sometimes disappearance is the truest kind of immortality. His empire covered the earth, yet his resting place covers only air and silence. He had been called the Lord of the Four Corners of the world, yet in death he claimed none of them. Historians and dreamers alike are haunted by the idea that he planned it this way. That the man who built an empire from motion would choose a grave without a mark, a place that could never be visited, never turned into a shrine, never claimed by any kingdom. In a world of monuments and memories, Genghis Khan left none. His tomb was not lost, it was erased. Even his descendants honored the silence. For generations, no one dared to speak of his resting place. The Ichkure, the secret guardians of his memory, were said to patrol the sacred valleys, keeping watch over lands no outsider could enter. Travelers who ventured too close to Burkhan Khaldun told of strange lights at night, of hooves echoing in the mist, as if ghostly riders still circled the mountain. Whether myth or memory, the feeling persists. That the great Khan's presence never left, only became invisible. The search for the tomb has become a reflection of humanity's obsession with permanence. We dig, scan, and probe, believing that to find the grave would somehow complete history. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more profound. Maybe the tomb was never meant to be found because it was never meant to exist in the way we imagine. Maybe the greatest conqueror of men wanted to conquer memory itself. Even in death, Genghis Khan commanded the world through paradox. His empire was built on movement, yet his tomb stands still. His name spread across continents, yet his body vanished without trace. He unified the world, then divided it again through mystery. And in that mystery, he endures. Every few years, new expeditions claim to be close. Ground-penetrating radar scans valleys once thought empty. Archaeologists pore over ancient Mongolian texts for clues. But always, something halts the search, funding lost, weather turning violent, permissions revoked. It is as if the land itself resists the intrusion. As if the steppe, loyal even after centuries, still guards its Khan. The Mongols once said that the sky and the earth are one, that the horizon is not a line but a meeting. Perhaps Genghis Khan's tomb is not beneath the earth at all, but within that meeting point. He does not lie in a single place, but in the wind, in the motion he gave the world. His grave, if it exists, may be everywhere the horizon touches the sky. There is a strange perfection in that thought. For a man who erased nations, who refused to be confined by walls, what could be more fitting than a tomb without boundaries? His death was not an end, but a return to the vastness from which he came. The eternal blue sky took him back, as it takes everything that moves too far or too fast. At night, when the wind crosses the grasslands of Mongolia, locals say it carries a rhythm, faint but unmistakable. The sound of hooves, the whisper of banners, the echo of a name too sacred to speak aloud. Somewhere within that silence, they say, the great Khan still rides, his spirit watching over the endless steppe. He erased his own grave to prove nothing can last forever, and in doing so, he became what every empire dreams of but few achieve eternity. Without a name, presence without form, memory without monument. The camera, if there were one, would pull back now, over the mountains, over the rivers, over the plains, where grass hides everything but time. The steppe stretches unbroken, a sea of green beneath the endless sky. Somewhere below, unseen and unmarked, lies the man who once held the world in his hand. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the secret was never about where he was buried, but what he wanted the world to remember. That even the greatest must return to the wind. The story now drifts toward its final meditation on memory, impermanence, and the silence that outlives all kings. The World Wide Web began on horseback. Long before fiber optic cables and satellites stitched the planet together, riders on the steppe carried messages faster than any kingdom could imagine. The Mongols, in their ruthless efficiency, had created the world's first network, not of machines, but of men, horses, and will. Centuries later, the pattern they drew across the earth still shapes our world. Every trade route, every diplomatic channel, every system of global reach carries, in its design, the faint imprint of their hooves. We tend to imagine modern globalization as something new, as if humanity only recently learned how to connect. But 800 years ago, Genghis Khan's empire had already bound continents into a single breathing organism. From the shores of China to the gates of Vienna, from the mountains of Persia to the plains of Hungary, his couriers and merchants moved with purpose. Their routes, like veins, pulsed with life. Goods, ideas, languages, and technologies flowed through them. The Mongols called their communication web the Yam, a network of relay stations, fresh horses, and safe passage. Today, we call it infrastructure. The modern world still runs on that same logic: connection through motion, control through speed. The Mongols proved that no empire, no matter how vast, could survive without communication. A delayed message could collapse a kingdom. A misdirected order could lose a war. Their solution relay systems, standardized permits, and signal fires was the blueprint for everything that followed. Postal routes, telegraphs, railways, and eventually the internet. The same principle drives both: an invisible chain linking distant points so that the world can think as one. Trade, too, bears their legacy. The Silk Roads, revived under Mongol rule, were not just paths of commerce, but arteries of civilization. Silk, spices, and silver once crossed them. Today, it is data, oil, and capital. Both systems thrive on trust, regulation, and flow, and both are vulnerable to the same dangers. The Mongols learned that connection spreads both wealth and plague. Our era, too, knows that networks amplify not only prosperity, but crisis. The Mongols unified the world by movement. We have unified it by speed. The difference is only one of tempo. Their empire taught humanity its first lesson in globalization, that prosperity demands tolerance. The Mongols ruled not through uniformity, but through coexistence. Within their realm, Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and shamans all served the same master. Traders from Venice sat beside scholars from Samarkand. Persian astronomers worked in Chinese observatories. It was messy, imperfect, but revolutionary. The idea that the world could function as a single, diverse organism began there beneath the eternal blue sky. Modern multiculturalism, international law, even global diplomacy, all trace their first breaths to the Mongol experiment in organized diversity. And yet, for all they created, their memory remains faint. Their name conjures more destruction than design, more conquest than connection. Perhaps that is fitting. The world they left us was not meant to bear their name, it was meant to endure their pattern. They had no interest in being remembered for what they built. They cared only that it worked. The Mongols ruled through systems so effective that they vanished into normalcy. What began as innovation became instinct. Look closely, and their echoes appear everywhere. The modern passport descends from the paisa, the bronze tablet that guaranteed safe travel under the Khan's authority. Our logistics networks mirror their relay stations. Global time zones, international banking routes, even diplomatic immunity, all carry traces of Mongol pragmatism. What we call globalization, they called survival. Their vision was not moral, but mechanical. They did not dream of uniting humanity out of compassion, but out of necessity. Yet in doing so, they stumbled upon something larger, the realization that the earth, for all its vastness, behaves like a single mind. What one part suffers, another feels. What one creates, another inherits. It was a truth born not from philosophy, but from motion, from the endless riding between worlds. And it is a truth that has never left us. Every time a message crosses an ocean in a second, it rides the ghost of a horse. Every time goods move seamlessly between nations, they follow paths first carved by caravans. Every global summit, every trade deal, every act of translation across borders is a quiet continuation of the Mongol dream, a world that can move faster than division. But just as in their time, the gift of connection carries a cost. The Mongols learned that an empire linked too tightly can strangle itself. Their unity bred efficiency but also dependency. When one region faltered, the others suffered. When the center weakened, the whole web collapsed. Today, our world faces the same paradox. Our speed binds us together, yet our fragility hides within that same bond. The Mongols' fall is not just history, it is prophecy. Their story reminds us that progress without memory repeats its own cycle. The very systems that make us global also make us vulnerable. The Mongols built an empire on communication. When communication broke, it all unraveled. The lesson remains unchanged. No matter how advanced our tools, the thread that holds the world together is trust. Without it, the network becomes noise. Still, there is beauty in what they began. In an age when most kingdoms could not imagine a world beyond their walls, the Mongols saw the planet as one horizon. They rode across it as if it were a single field, unbroken, infinite. That vision, the sense that all distances can be crossed, has never died. It is the quiet inheritance of every traveler, every innovator, every dreamer who believes that borders are only pauses, not endings. Their empire was built on motion, and our world still moves in its image. Airplanes trace the same skies once watched by Mongol scouts. Fiber cables run along routes that once echoed with hoofbeats. Even the dream of instant communication, the desire to collapse distance, was born from their relentless need to connect. The great Khan would have understood our networks perfectly. He would have seen them not as miracles, but as extensions of a logic he already knew, that power belongs to those who can move information fastest. But beyond all systems and strategies lies something deeper, the spirit of movement itself. The Mongols believed that to live was to move, to change, to adapt. Their world was one of impermanence, and perhaps that is why it endured longer than any monument. They left us no temples, no statues, no graves, only momentum. The same restless pulse that once drove their horses now drives our technology, our economies, our ambitions. We still chase horizons, even if our hooves are now made of light. The world they left us is not a relic, it is a mirror. In our global networks, in our constant motion, we can still glimpse the reflection of a civilization that refused to stand still. They taught the world how to move as one, and in doing so, taught us how fragile unity can be. The steppe is quiet now, but the roads still hum. The wind that once carried Mongol riders now carries signals and dreams. What began as conquest became communication. What began as empire became connection. The world they left us is the one we live in. We just gave it another name. And as the story turns to its final reflection, one truth remains. Memory and silence are not opposites, they are how history breathes. Empires die, but the dust remembers their heartbeat. The steppe lies quiet now. No banners ripple across its horizon, no thunder of hooves disturbs the wind. The grass sways in long, unbroken waves, and the earth hums with a memory older than names. Somewhere beneath it, the bones of riders sleep beneath the soil they once ruled. The world they built is gone, but the silence it left behind still moves. The Mongols believed that the sky was eternal and the earth unchanging, that all things born beneath them would one day return to both. Perhaps that is why their story feels so complete. They did not vanish. They simply drifted back into the elements that made them. The empire that once spanned continents has dissolved into air and legend, its vastness reduced to whispers and echoes. Yet in that fading, there is no tragedy, only truth. The sky forgets, but the world remembers differently. Every empire believes itself immortal. The Romans built in stone, the Chinese in order, the Persians in art, the Mongols built in motion. They believed the only permanence worth pursuing was movement itself, the kind that leaves no ruin behind, only change. And in that sense, they may have been the wisest of all. The cities they conquered crumbled, their language scattered, their laws erased, but the world they set in motion never stopped. Their silence became a rhythm. It hides in the hum of modern life, in the flight of airplanes tracing invisible lines across the sky, in the network cables beneath oceans carrying voices at the speed of thought, in the global pulse of trade and travel, where every point touches every other. The Mongols are gone, but the pattern they created still beats beneath our feet. If one listens closely, history itself sounds like a horse's gallop, rising, falling, then fading into distance. No civilization escapes that rhythm. The great mistake of power is to believe it can outrun time. The Mongols knew better. Even at their height, they treated the world not as possession but as passage. Their tents could be folded in a moment, their palaces left behind without regret. They lived with one foot in eternity and the other in impermanence. That is what made them dangerous and what makes them unforgettable. Now the grass has reclaimed the roads they built. The winds that once carried their messages now carry only the sighs of the earth, and yet their absence feels alive. In the steppes' quiet, there is movement not of armies, but of memory. The dust shifts, as if something beneath still breathes. The Mongols are gone, but the land has learned their language. Every gust of wind speaks it. There is a strange comfort in their disappearance. For all their violence, their ambition, their hunger for conquest, the Mongols understood something essential that nothing endures except the act of passing through. To live forever is not to be remembered, but to be absorbed. Like rain sinking into soil, they vanished into the world they shaped. The empire ended, but its particles scattered everywhere, carried by trade, by culture, by the endless motion of human longing. The Mongols did not leave ruins. They left momentum. And perhaps that is a purer form of immortality. When a stone temple collapses, it becomes dust. When a road erodes, it becomes a trail. When a name is forgotten, its echo becomes part of the wind. Their legacy was never meant to be worshipped, it was meant to be lived through. Every connection, every crossing of borders, every attempt to make the world whole again is, in some small way, their continuation. In Mongolia, old herders still raise their faces to the open sky and whisper to the wind before a journey. It is not prayer, it is remembrance. They do not speak Genghis Khan's name aloud, it is too heavy, too sacred, but they feel him in the air, in the vastness that asks for nothing and gives everything. The sky forgets, they say, but the earth remembers. In that duality lies the essence of their faith, that forgetting is not loss, but renewal. Perhaps that is the secret of history itself. It is not a story of permanence, but of transformation. Every empire becomes soil for the next. Every name feeds another's tongue. The Mongols once thought the eternal blue sky watched over all creation, calm, indifferent, infinite. Maybe that sky still watches, its vast silence reflecting the truth that even the greatest are only passing guests upon the wind. If you stand today upon the plains, where their riders once gathered, you will see no monuments, no marble, no ruins, only horizon, only sky. Yet, in that emptiness, there is something larger than memory, a sense that everything that has ever existed still moves through the air, unseen but eternal. The Mongols taught the world how to move as one, but their greatest lesson came in their vanishing, that even movement must one day rest, and that rest is not the end, but the return. The world forgets names, because it must. It makes room for new ones, new empires, new dreams, yet nothing is truly lost. Every idea leaves its trace. Every heartbeat leaves its vibration in the fabric of time. The Mongols no longer ride, but their rhythm endures in every exchange between nations, in every word carried across languages, in every moment when humanity reaches across distance instead of building another wall. History is not a monument, it is a windstorm. It erases what it builds, then builds again from what it erases. And through it all, the dust remembers. The dust remembers the hooves, the cries, the fire, the faith. It remembers how briefly the world belonged to one will. It remembers how power turned to silence, and how, from that silence, the world learned to move again. Empires die, but the dust remembers their heartbeat. The Mongols rode into history like a storm and left it like a breath. Their memory, now diffused across centuries, has become part of the world's quiet balance. Not victory, not loss, just motion turned to stillness, and stillness turned to peace. The sky forgets their names, but not their pattern. And that, perhaps, is immortality, the kind that asks for no monuments, no prayers, no return. Only the understanding that to fade is also to become infinite. The story ends where it began, under an endless sky, with the sound of wind over grass, and the whisper of a name that no longer needs to be spoken. Everything passes, everything remains. And somewhere, in the hush between the earth and the heavens, the dust still remembers how to breathe.